Jackal among snakes. Author, Nemorosus. Synopsis: the royal bastard of House Vaska, Argrave, changed after his stay studying magic at the Tower of the Grey Owl. The sickly man's awkward posture and cruel behavior have been replaced with a neat dignity and acerbic wit. Though once listless, he now strives towards his goals with a life-or-death tenacity. Most come away thinking he seems to know too many details about too much. Few can claim to know his motives or his goals. Yet behind that confident appearance, the primary contributor for an open-world RPG's wiki battles existential dread and things far beyond his ken as he struggles to adapt to a grim, gothic fantasy world mirroring his favorite game. The prospect of fighting against a world-ending calamity loses all of its appeal when it transitions from entertainment to reality. Argrave is spurred towards unwanted heroism to preserve his life as he struggles desperately to keep this sinking ship afloat. Chapter 1, Valhalla-Bound. At the speed of sound. In the middle of a vast plain, a single, well-traveled dirt road led to a tower. The tower was circular and made wholly of a dark grey stone, and it stood hundreds, if not 1,000 feet tall. Stained glass windows dotted its side points. Its walls were inscribed, giving the stark grey building depth it otherwise lacked. If one were to stare for a while, they could see faint trails of light dancing along the engravings. They were the dim afterglow of enchantments that kept such a piece of architecture standing. On one of the floors in the middle of the colossal structure, a set of grey eyes stared out the stained glass window, peering at the sun. Or rather, the sun's dual balls of fire stood high in the sky, partially shielded by clouds. One star was white, the other orange. The white star was the smaller of the two. The owner of the grey eyes was a remarkably tall man with wavy obsidian-color hair. He sat cross-legged at a window-side table, a bronze hand mirror hanging loosely from his idle hand. He wore drab grey robes that looked to be made of burlap. An owl had been sewn onto the shoulders of his garments. The robes covered his figure well, but his pale bony fingers and gaunt face betrayed a skinny physique. Despite his gauntness, though, he was quite handsome. The man's name was Argrave. Staring at these two suns in the sky, he was rather confident he had gone through the 5 stages of grief in the past few hours: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. The subject of his grief was himself, or rather, his past life. Argrave's first reaction, denial, could perhaps be considered ordinary when awakening in a body wholly unfamiliar to him. These long, skinny legs and these harsh, steely eyes must have been the result of an overactive subconscious. He was sure alternate realities were merely theories without evidence. This transmigration must be a fever dream induced by, well, fever, naturally. But reality refused to change, and he was forced to confront a fact. He had transmigrated into a game, namely, Heroes of Berenda. In the anger phase of grief, Argrave stewed over what he had left. He was just a college student midway through his studies. At that, his life was just beginning. Now, he was here. He was in a miserable world where most of the cities lack basic sanitation. But Argrave had always been a calm person in his past life, and his anger faded quickly. Argrave III tried to bargain in his process of grief. He pleaded to whatever existence had taken him here to take him back, or better yet, to give him a different character. Why had he transmigrated into this game, Heroes of Berenda? Why had he transmigrated into Argrave of Vaska, a person all but universally reviled? Argrave of Vaska was a bastard of the royal family, not some noble scion. He was but a minor NPC in Heroes of Berenda, and one who met a very unpleasant end regardless of the player's interference. But Argrave's pleas went unanswered, and his situation did not change. Argrave IV sank into the most infamous stage of grief, depression. He had gone from a college student to a miserable, sickly, and altogether worthless villain. Many people felt a good degree of ill will towards him. The fact that it was his favorite game did little to curb his mental anguish. Even if he wished to enjoy the world of Heroes of Berenda, he would need to navigate away from the 1,000 pitfalls Argrave had by his feet. To his fortune, the worst of the 5 stages came and went quickly. Argrave V entered a tranquil acceptance. This was his life. He was in a bad position, sure, but in Heroes of Berenda, his future prospects were limitless. That could be said for everyone, of course. But having those prospects and knowing how to use them was different. Argrave knew more about this world than most of its denizens. After all, some would call Argrave in his former life a lore master, or perhaps a master of esoteric knowledge. Most preferred the term, weird nerd that fills out game wikis. Some people had to be martyrs, delving through the game for thousands of hours to fill out wiki articles that future players would use. Argrave was one such underappreciated saint. He was the primary contributor to the Heroes of Berenda wiki. One might think this extensive knowledge would reassure Argrave. Instead, it only served as fuel for his dread. A game, especially an open-world action RPG like Heroes of Berenda, use conflict to make players have fun. Heroes of Berenda was fun, indeed. It had great wars, foul monsters, ancient calamities and gods, and other such fun gameplay. The game was a grim gothic fantasy. Yet another detail bothered Argrave more. The game had 9 pre-made characters to select from, each with varying styles. One could make a custom character, too. Their personalities were all different, as were the paths they took to confront the final boss, Hitchhiking. Only one thing remained consistent, no matter which of them the player selected. Argrave lifted the bronze hand mirror on the table. He didn't see his grey eyes looking back at him. Instead, a familiar sight greeted him. Traits: tall, sickly, weak, intelligent, magic of inity, high. Skills: elemental magic, D, blood magic, D, healing magic, D, illusion magic, D, inscription, E, imbuing, E. The bronze hand mirror was how the player viewed their stats. So much had been ripped away, he could not see his attributes, for instance, nor his health and fatigue. The menu had been stripped of all but the basics. This simple mirror was the heaviest thing Argrave had ever held. Without fail, this little mirror followed the player through every second of Heroes of Berenda. It was a companion to importance, a symbol, unwittingly, to duty. The player decided the fate of many things in the continent of Berenda, through their action or inaction. Invasions, civil wars, plagues, monster incursions, and above all, looming like a guillotine, the ancient calamity Hitchhiking. The player decided how this world would end up, and the player always had the very bronze hand mirror Argrave held. His grip tightened around the hand mirror. Suddenly, he threw it aside. It bounced against the wall, ringing quietly, and then slid across the floor while spinning. He watched it as it spun, twirling wildly about like some twisted game of spin the bottle. It stopped pointing at Argrave's bed. Argrave leaned against the table, kneading his forehead as he stared at the mirror. He chuckled to himself and shook his head, throwing tantrums like I'm a child. What is this? He stood from the chair and walked over to pick up the mirror. He picked it up, and then walked to the bed where he cleaned it off with a white bedsheet. He gazed at the simple menu in the mirror, walking to the window where the dual suns still stood outside. He could remember those traits and skills displayed on the menu by heart. He had written many of their articles on the wiki. Argrave sighed and sat on the windowsill. The former Argrave was not untalented. Intelligent was a very good trait. It increased all skill gains by 25%. It was worse than quick or genius, but such traits were rarer than rare, and no original main character possessed it. What's more, a high in magic of inity was a godsend for a mage character. These extreme blessings were combated by their weak and sickly traits. Weak was fixable if he exercised and ate properly. Sickly made doing so impossible. That trait could not be removed by ordinary means. He would never be a warrior, not for a long time, at least. Fortunately, Argrave had no intention of being a warrior. He disliked touching people, and doubly so touching blood. The path of magic suited him. Jesus Christ. I'm considering things. I guess this is really happening. He lowered the mirror and stared outside. Player 1's inserting his coin. He's getting ready for a flawless, deathless playthrough. He took a deep breath and exhaled. A half laugh, half scoff came from his lips. Who am I kidding? I'm Valhalla-Bound at the speed of sound. Argrave looked at the hand mirror once more. He studied the handle, the back of it. Then, his hand clenched again, this time, not to throw, but to hold tight. I have to go forward. If I do nothing, everything will fall apart. Argrave smiled at the mirror, though there was no reflection. Who knows? Maybe there's a third continue. Can't imagine I'll have a heavier burden the third go of things. When Argrave stood this time, he did so with a vigor he lacked previously. He looked around his room, genuinely taking in his surroundings for the first time. Between this stuffy robe and the books and papers strewn all about, Argrave could confidently deduce that, at present, he was still an acolyte in the Order of the Grey Owl. In other terms, he was still in training to become a full-fledged wizard of the Order. Argrave of Vaska was a wizard from the game's beginning, meaning the game had not begun yet. If that was the case, his list of enemies would not be so large. In particular, Argrave had not irreparably damaged his relationship with one of the 9 playable characters, Nicoletta of Montesai. An acolyte had to submit a thesis to graduate from an acolyte to a wizard, and Argrave had possession of Nicoletta's as part of the royal family's conspiracy. Think about that later. Argrave dismissed. Argrave found a pair of black gloves in the drawer and pulled them on. There was a symbol on the back of the gloves, a golden snake curling around a sword. It was the symbol of House Vaska, the royal family. Argrave was a bastard of that family. It's like a cursed mark, Argrave commented. I think my family is the most likely to kill me. I need information. Argrave reflected. I need to find out how much time I have to plan, and I need to get my bearings. I need to assess the situation and proceed calmly. A well-formed plan is the foundation to success. The one who loses makes but few calculations beforehand. With a clear direction in his head, Argrave looked around the room once more. Papers were strewn everywhere, books and food were laid about without any regard, and nothing was in order. First, I should clean. Will help me think, plan, Argrave muttered. And then, I act. Chapter 2, Unsocial Visit. Argrave stared at a plaque on the side of the wall. It read Nicoletta of Montesai. He carried a stack of documents wrapped by a few strings in his right hand. He felt calm. All of the faces that he saw in the tower he recognized. Indeed, there was nothing to suggest that anything had changed from the original heroes of Berenda in terms of setting. He had even gleaned the date from passing conversation. It was a month before acolytes had to submit their research to the Order, and therefore, near a month and a half before the game began in earnest. While cleaning, he had found a peculiarly well-hidden stack of papers, which now rested in his hands. In the original plot, Induna Vaska, Argrave's half-brother and heir to the throne, used his influence within the Order to steal Nicoletta's thesis. When her research was stolen, she presumed it lost, and consequently tried to remake it hastily. The remake was deemed a shabby copy of the original copy Argrave held. Thus, Nicoletta was expelled. It would do him no good to gain the enmity of one of the main characters. Nicoletta was the daughter of a duke. Argrave adjusted the stack of papers, pulled his gloves tight across his fingers. Then, he raised his hand to the oaken door and knocked thrice. He looked around as time passed. People stared at him, he noticed, but they refused to meet his eyes. His reputation was already quite bad. It seemed, after receiving no answer, Argrave knocked again. More time passed. Argrave wondered if she might be out. He knocked one last time. The door swung open, and he was greeted by a fierce glare from a very disheveled-looking black-haired woman. Nicoletta had not been expecting his presence, evidently, and she lifted her head up very slowly to look up at him. "Cousin," he greeted calmly. "Come what may." Argrave always had confidence in his words. "You are." She fixed her hair and stood with a straighter posture. "Hello, Argrave. I thought you were my friend." "Forgive my appearance, I am not your friend," Argrave noted. "How hurtful." "That's... She took a step back. "I could," Argrave interrupted. "You were expecting Mina of Veden, I presume." "That one always seems to hang around you." Nicoletta stared at him blankly, eyes wide. Her eyes were a dark, rich pink. Argrave found the color pretty. "May I come in?" Argrave asked when she did not speak. Argrave's words brought her back to attention. "Now isn't a good time. I'm in the middle of something," she said firmly, grasping the door as though to shut it. Argrave had a notion as to what that something was, frantically trying to recreate the research that had been stolen from her. "I would not come here for a social visit," Argrave said cryptically. Nicoletta's hand fell away from the door and she stepped back. She looked at what Argrave was holding, scrutinizing him carefully. After some time, she pushed the door open and gestured. "Come in." Argrave nodded and stepped forward. He failed to duck low enough to pass beneath the door and bumped his forehead. He cleared his throat in the awkwardness that followed, and then proceeded onward into her dorm room. Her room was quite messy, but then Argrave had been expecting it to be so. Nicoletta was a playable character, so her personality was somewhat determined by player choice. By and large, though, she had consistent personality traits. She had been disorganized in the game, too. That these details aligned made Argrave more confident. Books were scattered everywhere. Crumpled parchments lined the floor. Research materials and equipment were plastered all over the place. Perhaps the only saving grace of this den of wretchedness was the lack of half-eaten food. Besides Nicoletta's bed and desk, there was one set of furniture in the room, two couches parallel to each other, a low-lying table in between them. Nicoletta walked past Argrave and picked up a stack of books, clearing room for the two to sit. "Have a seat," she gestured. Argrave stared at the couch like it was a snarling dog, a blank look in his dead grey eyes. "I will stand." Argrave held out a hand to refuse. "I will not take much of your time, so you can resume what you were doing in short order. Though I suspect you will not need to." Nicoletta glared at him, gaze flitting between the wrapped documents in his hand and his eyes. She wasn't slow-witted. He had given enough hints for her to piece things together. She, too, refused to sit. "Here." Argrave held the documents out, tired of dancing around the issue. "Your stolen research. Damn it all, you bastard!" she shouted, tearing them from his hands. "I knew it. I knew that you stole it." She guarded them in her arms delicately. "Well, I am a bastard in a literal sense," Argrave conceded, pulling his gloves tighter as he stepped back. "Figuratively, though, I must disagree. I also did not steal your thesis." "Oh, she half laughed. "You didn't steal these papers. You just happened to find them." "How am I to believe that?" "Half right." Argrave shook his head. "I did not steal them. They were given to me by Indune, my half-brother, your cousin, the heir presumptive of Vaska. You may know him. He's rather famous." She walked a fair distance away and set down the papers on her desk angrily. "You expect me to believe the Crown Prince took her off with my dissertation?" Argrave shook his head again. "No, I imagine he has people for that. Thieves and such." "Why would he do it himself?" "I can't believe someone like you is my cousin," she said, entirely ignoring his words. Be quiet for a moment," Argrave said loudly, calm yet firm. Nicoletta tensed at his voice. "Think. Use your head. Jog your noggin." He tapped his forehead. "I wouldn't be returning this if I was at fault. I'm not one for a guilty conscience, and even if I was, I'd use a subtler method." Nicoletta stepped forward, crossing her arms. She sized up Argrave, then sighed and sat at the couch. "You're right. I'll listen." Argrave clasped his hands together. "As I said, Indune gave that to me as a gift. It doesn't fit, so I'm returning it. My thesis has been missing for a long while, Nicoletta countered. Why return it now? Argrave stepped a little closer. Look at it from my view. It's a gift, but it comes with an implication. He wishes to use me as an acolyte within the order to suppress you, to suppress House Montesai. There is no greater stain to your house's honor and legitimacy than expulsion. If I keep it, I anger Duke Enrico. If I return it, I anger June, heir to the throne. Is it any wonder I will deliberate on this matter? Nicoletta stared at Argrave, her frown slowly deepening. But why would Dune try and suppress one of the king's faithful vassals? We've never antagonized the royal family because of your mother. Argrave pointed at her face. Being descended from my aunt, King Felipe's sister, marks you as one of very few with a legitimate claim to the throne of Vasca. With his point spoken, Argrave took a second to breathe. My father, he said reluctantly, is old. Succession is a pertinent issue. Dune is a paranoid man who prefers to crush problems before they arise. But I am no bludgeon, and I will not trample you for my own success or Vasca's success. Above all, I do not need it. Nicoletta turned her head away and rubbed her eyes. Argrave noticed only then how tired she looked. Eventually, she lifted her head and mumbled. It's plausible, but I don't know what to think. Argrave shrugged. Then don't think. Mark me as the culprit, if you wish. But what was yours once is yours again, and that is ultimately the end to the matter. I didn't come to ask for a favor or broker a deal. I merely came to do what is right. Her dark pink eyes locked with his gaze, and both were silent for a time. Then, she nodded. I don't know if I can thank you, not for this. How disappointing. I was expecting a tear-filled expression of utmost gratitude, Argrave said drolly. If I can suggest something, though, buy an enchanted lockbox. They're designed to keep things safe, especially precious things that might determine your future livelihood. Gemstones, important documents, things of that sort. I know what a lockbox is, she said in irritation. Just go? Argrave finished her sentence, already turning around. If you insist. He reached for the doorknob to leave, but Nicoletta called out, wait. Something more you need to ask? Argrave said patiently. Did you? Nicoletta looked back at the stack of neatly wrapped papers. Did you read it? My thesis, that is. Argrave turned away from the door and considered how to answer that question. In the game, the player never had the opportunity to dissect the text thoroughly. It was summarized, but nothing more. Not thoroughly. But yes, Argrave said vaguely. It was about the dynamics of wind-type elemental magic. No? Yes, it was, she answered quickly, eyes fixed on him. Some time passed, and then she held her hands out. And what? Argrave tilted his head, confused. What did you think? She insisted, frustrated he wasn't understanding. Argrave snorted. Wind magic doesn't consume much of your magic, it's fast-acting, but it lacks the power the other elements have. Nicoletta threw her hands up in frustration. Sounds like you're just repeating what the teachers have been telling us. No, Argrave disagreed. He shifted on his feet. Every element has its place. Wind magic, for instance, utterly invalidates bows, crossbows, and other such ranged projectiles. Fire magic is good for chaos and destruction. Water magic is the most neutral of them all, but it has uses outside of combat, and it counters fire nicely. Earth magic, too. Argrave paused, realizing he was caught up in talking. Why am I still here? I have things to do. Wait, Nicoletta said once more as he reached for the doorknob again. I said this wasn't a social visit. Argrave muttered to himself. One more thing, Nicoletta assured. She enjoyed talking about magic, evidently. She became a mage for a reason. What about electric magic? Argrave smiled. It's the best, naturally. Fast-moving, destructive, accurate, and debilitating. What's not to love? The only demerit is its magic expenditure. But there are ways around that, of course. So is that, as much as I would love to talk more, I really must go. I'll leave you with this. Be careful. As the heir to Duke Enrico, you have many friends, and as many enemies. Argrave pointed at her. He opened the door and walked out the door, but he forgot to duck once more. He slammed his head against the top of the doorframe and staggered a little, before slamming the door shut behind him. Chapter 3, Choosing Between Boredom and Suffering. Nicoletta stared at the closed door a long time after Argrave had left. Her mind was disturbed by 1,000 thoughts. She had not interacted with her cousin much at all. He was the bastard of the royal family, and she the sole daughter of the Duke of Montesai. Even if they were both in the Order of the Grey Owl, there had been little occasion for them to interact. The only situation she recalled was 3 years ago when she was 17. That said, he was nothing like she remembered. Previously, he had been a reticent and awkward teenager. Though he had the same tall, skinny body that made one question if he was starving himself, his actions now had a neat dignity. Perhaps some of that awkwardness remains, Nicoletta thought as she recalled him banging his head. It was oddly endearing, though. She shook her head to get out of her stupor, and then turned to the documents Argrave had delivered. She'd still yet to verify if it was truly what she'd lost. She tore off the neatly wrapped strings and pulled off page after page, checking if everything was as she remembered it. After she had got to the end of it, her knees buckled and she collapsed to the table, chuckling. It's all there. It's really all there. She kept laughing like a maniac for a time as she felt the burden of the world lift from her shoulders. She had been in a desperate panic the past few days trying to recreate this. Now, her cousin, whom she had only dislike of and firmly believed to be someone of ill character, had simply handed it to her. "I don't get him," she said aloud. Was he trying to win her favor? Certainly, as the daughter of Duke Enrico, Nicoletta was someone worthy of befriending for material gain. She always kept that in mind for all of her interactions, and it had saved her much heartache throughout the years. "I suppose it doesn't matter now that I have this. I just have to be cautious of him in the future." She looked at her papers with a smile. "Though, maybe I could get Mina to do some investigating." Nicoletta stood again. She had a month of free time now that she had her dissertation back. Perhaps she didn't need to take Argrave's word. Perhaps she could find out the truth of the matter on her own. Argrave wiped his slightly red forehead with his black handkerchief. Door frames were probably not especially dirty, but it was better to be safe than sorry, especially so if I'm sickly. Argrave noted. A medieval world was not a clean place. Many cities lacked sewers, the people seldom washed, and the standards of living were generally lower. At the very least, healing mages abated some of that uncleanliness. Nevertheless, Argrave was unsettled by the prospect of touching people, and pulled his gloves tighter over his hands. Argrave returned to his dorm without issue. This time, he had the foresight to duck, and avoided hitting his head an embarrassing third time. Once inside, he stared at the room. What now? Out of habit, Argrave walked into the room and began cleaning things up. He had already cleaned, but the room was not spotless. He dusted with a piece of cloth and organized the books by size. Perhaps I should just leave. Accept expulsion from the Order of the Grey Owl. Completing the research would be a tedious thing, and even if Argrave put in a full effort, he was not confident in success. He had read every in-game book and written thorough articles on the magic law, yet there was still a gulf between fiction and reality. Argrave conjured some sparks on his finger. He rank elemental magic, and though performing magic came naturally, theory and research might not. At the same time, being in the Order of the Grey Owl was restricting. Before one received status as a full-fledged wizard, it was somewhat like a monastic order. One would discard their family name during their stay, and further could not hold lands or receive incomes. They were barred from coming and going freely. Most mage orders were like that to ensure some semblance of political neutrality. Argrave noticed some books off a shelf and stacked them up in his arms to transfer them back onto the shelf. The simple act of moving books winded him, much to his embarrassment. He sat down to gather himself. No. Leaving would be imprudent. Respect lost is difficult to regain. The former Argrave already saddled me with a terrible reputation, and if I make it any worse, it will be difficult to have mobility where I need it. I must stay within the order. Besides, I might take this month to sort out my strengths, decide my course of action, and identify the various ticking time bombs this world has left near the royal bastard Argrave. Argrave most preferred well-organized plans. That applied doubly so if the matter involved himself, or, rather, his new self. He would need to identify problems both present and future and decide a course of action to correct them. Boons could be handled in the same way, identify them and decide how to obtain them. Argrave sat at his desk and began planning for his future. It was not so different from planning for college, he supposed. Only, no, don't get distracted. After a long day of planning and drafting, Argrave tried to sleep. The height would have been an issue, but the former Argrave had laid 2 beds side by side to accommodate his larger frame, and he could lie soundly. Indeed, despite the medieval nature of his environment, things were quite comfortable for him. He could find no issue on that front for sleeping. The issue was an overactive mind. As Argrave stared at the ceiling, the questions he had been able to ignore most of the day welled up. What exactly was happening? Had he died? The former person who he was, at least? He remembered nothing of what he had been doing before this, and the days blended together. He tried to suppress his meandering mind and will himself to sleep, staying totally still in the cool night air. He tried some mental exercises to have sleep wash over him, but it was fruitless. The questions kept coming unbidden. Perhaps his mother was crying over a casket at the moment. Maybe he had simply vanished. Would anyone notice if he had? Hobbyist wiki editors weren't exactly socialites, and he was no exception. Perhaps none of this was real at all. Maybe. Forget this. Argrave sat up and threw the covers off. He quickly put on the neatly folded robe he'd set beside his bed and made for the door. He retrieved a small glass orb attached to a piece of metal from the sconce beside the door. He willed a bit of his magic inside it, and it lit up. The great room outside his dorm in the Tower of the Grey Owl was well lit, but there was neither smoke from torches nor warmth from fire. The mages used magic lamps identical to the one he held to light the place. As skinny as he was, Argrave was quite cold, and he held his gloved hands beneath the long sleeves of his robe. Despite how late the night was, people were still out. His gaze wandered to the window, where a giant red moon illuminated the stone in uneven red moonbeams matching the shape of the windows. There was a massive crater in the center of it, making it look like a giant red eye in the sky. Watching all that occurred below, Argrave stopped in his tracks and stared at the moon so unfamiliar to the one he knew. He felt a chill on his spine. Seeing this moon, His mind accepted a fact that he had been subconsciously denying. He was not who he used to be, nor was he where he used to be. This was a different realm, a different world. Maybe it would be stranger if he were not unnerved. Existential questions like these were natural. The fact that he had avoided them for so long was only because he had kept his mind busy. As I need to do now. Keep busy. Keep moving. After pulling the rope's hood over his head, Argrave headed for the circular room in the center of the tower. It was host to an elevator of sorts. That circular room was the only way to descend or ascend floors, and he intended to head to the library to gather the things necessary to begin the creation of his thesis. As Argrave neared the elevator, he heard quiet footsteps rapidly approaching him from behind. He turned in time to pull his shoulders away from a hand, and they gripped air. A rather well-built man stood there, correcting his posture after his bid to grab Argrave failed. The man had short red hair and bright eyes of the same color. His handsome tan face reflected the light from the magic lamp Argrave held. He was a fair bit shorter than Argrave, but still quite tall. He was certainly broader than Argrave, the grey robes of the Order clinging tightly to his robust frame. Argrave recognized him very well. Elias, Argrave greeted, taking a step back and illuminating the man with the glowing orb he held. He had rather hoped to avoid speaking with this man, but it was probably unavoidable. Elias of Parban was the son of a Margrave who had an irreconcilable grudge against Argrave. For good reason, granted. In the original game, if the player chose Nicoletta, they would hunt down Argrave for vengeance during the story. If not, Elias gave the player the side quest to investigate and consequently slay Argrave of Vaska, who had turned to human experimentation. Elias. The man in question repeated Argrave's greeting. Not your typical response to seeing me. What, did I shock you? Catch you doing something illicit? If going to the library is a crime, Argrave nodded. Elias tilted his head up, staring at Argrave in the eyes. The library, is it? At such a late time? Argrave sighed, fuse feeling short on account of recent annoyances. What? Perhaps you wish to tuck me in and sing me a lullaby till I fall asleep. Your concern is touching, but stop wasting my time. Elias did not break his gaze. I told you when you came here that I would be keeping an eye on you. Have you? Fine. Need I remind you that keeping an eye on me is wholly different from bothering me? You can watch as much as you like, though I would prefer it be at a distance. And silently, Argrave turned around and walked into the central room. He questioned briefly if he was being rash, but Argrave did not expect to have much conflict or interaction with Elias in the future. Their differences were difficult to set aside. He could only avoid him. Innumerable stone platforms floated over a very long drop. They had symbols inscribed on the top, and a strange purple light bordered them. If one were to try and jump, they find intense winds barring them from moving beyond the door. Instead, one would turn into the right and input where they intended to go into the keypad-like interface. Argrave pressed a button for the second floor, and with nary a sound, all of the stone platforms in the room began to shift. If this had been the game, he would have been holding W, pushing his character forward against the barrier while waiting impatiently for the platform to appear. Now, it was all rather wondrous. Elias stood a fair bit behind Argrave, watching with brows furrowed. The stone platform appeared, and the barrier barring him from walking forward fell away with an audible pop. Argrave stepped on the platform. His shoes suddenly seized, and he found his soles stuck to the platform. Then, the platform began moving downwards, twisting around the innumerable other platforms, some empty, some containing other students or wizards. It was a trivial thing, perhaps, but it was nonetheless thrilling to Argrave. With his previous issues forgotten, a smile rose to his face unbidden. Above, Elias had also boarded a platform. Argrave's smile faded a little, and he shook his head on the route to the library. Chapter 4, Hot Nights, Cool Looks. Argrave scanned the bookshelf, holding the ensconced magic lamp up to the titles as he walked by in search of the tomes that he needed. In his periphery, he could spot a dash of red hair, the self-righteous Elias of Parban. He was keeping an eye on Argrave just as he promised. He kept his distance, so Argrave could not complain overmuch. The library of the Order of the Grey Owl was very grand. Argrave estimated the bookshelves to be around 20 feet tall. Some wizards and students were reading late into the night at the tables set out, and many more were patrolling the halls, guarding the precious books and helping those who needed help. Argrave had been here many times before in Heroes of Berenda and knew this library better than them, so he did not need their help. Books moved about daily in a library, though, so he would need to search for what he needed. He started to accrue a small pile of books in his arms. They felt heavy, far heavier than they had any right being. So weak, Argrave thought as he stared at his arms. Elias, Argrave called out. The man in question walked towards him slowly. I thought you said not to bother you, Elias spoke, tone cold. You are no bother. Have higher self-esteem. Argrave stared at Elias. He sighed in defeat. What do you want? Look at my arms, like bamboo, though not half as strong. In contrast, there is you, Justice Lover, protector of the weak, with arms as thick as my legs. Look how my arms tremble carrying these books. Perhaps you could help the weak right now? Elias stared at him. His red eyes were quite cold, and his expression remained stern. What are you doing? Pardon? Asked Argrave. I said, what are you doing? Elias repeated. He pointed at Argrave. You crippled my sister. You wish to talk about weak? He pushed his finger into Argrave's arm, pushing him slightly. She will never walk again. She doesn't smile like she used to. And for what? Because she denied a betrothal to you, a royal bastard, or perhaps just because you're sick? Don't quip and jape like we're good friends. I detest you. I suffer your presence so that you won't be able to torment others. I know your nature, and I'm trying my best to make sure no one else will. Argrave stared Elias in the eye for a time. The tension in the library palpable. Eventually, Argrave nodded. You are right. I apologize for being facetious. I am unskilled at detecting how other people feel. And regarding your sister, Elias' gaze hardened when Argrave mentioned her. I apologize. Sincerely. Argrave bowed, back straining beneath the weight of the books he'd stacked in his arms. Elias scoffed. You always maintained it was an accident. A horse gone out of control, he said contemptuously. Why would you apologize if that were the case? The fact that it was my fault does not change. I cannot change that, nor can I fix past mistakes. All I have is my words. So, I reiterate, I apologize. Elias' breathing quickened for a few moments as though he were angered, and he finally tore his gaze away from Argrave's own. Argrave turned back to the bookshelf, prepared to resume his task. Unexpectedly, the books he was holding were yanked from his grasp. Elias held them, grinding his teeth as he refused to meet Argrave's eye. He really is too kind for his own good. Argrave was not presumptuous enough to stack yet more books on top of what Elias had already taken, but he collected the remainder of the books that he needed in short order. They were all books about fundamental magic, beginner-level work to introduce a prospective reader into the world of magic. Elias seemed to be confused, but if he had questions, they went unasked. After, the two of them went to the library desk. The wizard there, a portly old man, glanced at the books. Did you fin? Yes, Argrave interrupted. I found everything. This is all. The librarian straightened his back, and then quickly wrote down the books Argrave was borrowing. Argrave sympathized briefly as he waited. It could not be easy to keep inventory with pen and paper as they had to in medieval times. With everything in order, the two took the path back to Argrave's room. Elias seemed to be internally questioning why he was even bothering doing this. But Argrave did not prod at him further with bad jokes. He did not wish to be left carrying these books alone, after all. Argrave pushed open the door to his room, adjusting the books precariously as he did so. He remembered to duck his head beneath the doorframe this time around. He put the magic lamp back in its spot, and then turned to look at the room. Something is askew, Argrave noted immediately. Things were not as neat as he left them. Some books had been moved, set aside, and some of his papers had been splayed out haphazardly over the edge, threatening to fall to the floor. Argrave always kept things neat. He would not have left his room like this. There was an intruder, or perhaps there still is an intruder. Elias walked past Argrave and set the books down, the wood creaking slightly beneath their weight. He placed a hand atop them and sighed, shaking his head as though disbelieving of what he had just done. When Elias saw that Argrave was standing there unmoving, he watched perplexedly. What is it? Elias asked. Nothing, Argrave said, the words drawing him out of his stupor. He walked to the table and set his stack of books down beside Elias. These books. They're beginner books. Why would an acolyte near the end of his term need a beginner's books, I wonder? Elias questioned. Stupidity, typically. A slow learner. Argrave said drolly. For my case, it is related to research. HMPH. Elias shook his head, evidently giving no credence to Argrave's words. Fine. I should note, though, that teaching magic to one outside of the Order of the Grey Owl without express permission is a punishable offense. Argrave walked back to the open door, partially blocking it with his body. Yes, I understand. I have nothing to hide. Elias took his hand off the books. He walked to the door, and Argrave let him pass before quickly blocking off the door again with his large frame. Elias looked at him strangely. What are you? He asked, trailing off. What? Argrave asked, feigning innocence. Elias looked beyond Argrave into the room, but eventually shook his head. Never mind. Elias, Argrave called out. Thank you. Elias stared Argrave in the eyes, staying silent. His crimson eyes were cold. Eventually, he turned away. Your thesis is about mending irreparably broken bones, no? For your sister, Argrave called out, recalling a detail. Elias had helped him despite loathing his guts. For that, Argrave could offer a little bit of knowledge he had accrued while playing Heroes of Berenda. The red-haired man stopped, turning on his heel and walking back towards Argrave. Who told you that? It matters not, dismissed Argrave. But there is a certain salamander in the hills of Visn. It is well known for its ridiculously efficient regeneration. The natives of that land eat the salamanders en masse, and some suggest that is the reason they are so healthy, in particular, why their warriors seem to be able to regrow even their limbs. You may wish to investigate that. Why would you know such a thing? Elias' stern gaze was laced with suspicion. I was born sickly, Argrave said quickly, excuse prepared in advance. I always investigate things related to health and healthiness. Why do you think I studied blood magic, the core of which is the study of vitality? After delivering another long wordless stare, Elias turned once more and walked away. Something tells me he won't make a great effort to remember what I said. Argrave shook his head. His loss. Argrave walked back inside and shut the door firmly, pushing the bolt in place and turning back to his room. Now, I suppose I should deal with the pesky little cat in my room. Argrave pulled his gloves tighter as he walked to the desk. He quietly straightened the papers on his desk, and then began putting the newly acquired books on a shelf one by one. He set aside a rather thin and light book and took a seat. Argrave closed his eyes and slowed his breathing. His heartbeat slowly quieted as he relaxed. Then, he heard it. A second set of breath, muffled as though behind cloth, but audible nonetheless. He strained his hearing to the limit until he pinpointed it. He grabbed the thin book he'd set aside. With as much speed as he could muster with his skinny arms, he threw the book. It spun through the air. A brief shriek, a yelp, almost, echoed throughout Argrave's room, and then the book impacted with what seemed to be nothing. The air shimmered and distorted as the spell of invisibility faded. A woman in grey robes fell backwards, struck by the spine of the book squarely in the face. She fell on top of Argrave's bed, rolling off it and collapsing ungracefully like a folded great owl. Argrave stood and walked over leisurely. He was in no danger. He recognized this person well. Mina of Veden flipped herself over, sitting up against the wall. She was a very small woman, 5 feet tall at most. She had medium-length blonde hair, bright enough to be called golden. Her eyes were green and sharp, almost cat-like. She had a thick red line on her cheek where the book had struck. Mina, Argrave said. Snooping as usual, I see. He held out a hand. Mina watched, caution written plainly on her face, and tried to reach for Argrave's hand. He had not intended to help her up, though. He bent down and retrieved the book, leaving her grasping at air. He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the book down. She stared at him incredulously, and helped herself up, huffing loudly. Did you assume I would help a trespasser to their feet? Argrave tossed the book on the bed lightly and sat down. Honestly, what were you thinking? I'm sorry, she said loudly, lowering her head. I did not think I would be back so quickly, or did not think I would notice you. Argrave leaned back. No, Mina assured quickly, waving her hands. I came to return this, she said, producing a small book and holding it in front. She continued speaking quickly, half babbling. When I saw that you were gone, I thought that I would just slip in and leave it on the desk, but then I heard the door opening, and I panicked, and then I just tried to hide and slip out, but then you. She trailed off, out of breath. Argrave had to admit, Mina's acting was quite convincing. Fortunately, he knew her character well enough to see through it. She was Nicoletta's best friend. She was also a very skilled illusion mage, a fantastic actor, and notoriously distrustful. Many players compared her to a cat, prickly, slow to trust, yet capable of deep affection nonetheless. She was a fan favorite for these reasons. Right. You rummaged through the papers on my desk to find the perfect place to return the book, I presume. And those books you took off their shelf. Probably to get a sense of how I organize my books. Yes. How diligent. Argrave shook his head. The acting is good, but the excuse is as flimsy. No, she said frantically. I know how it looks, but you have to. Frankly, you should have snuck out as soon as you saw the door open. You had time. Even after, when I was blocking the door, you could have pushed past. Indecision is your issue, Argrave said, pointing. Now, scurry on back to Nicoletta. I am tired of talking to people. Mina sat there, wide-eyed. What? Did this little book here addle your senses? Argrave weighed the book he'd thrown in his hands. Just go. He pointed towards the door. Nicoletta probably sent you here to spy on me. But truthfully I cannot be bothered. Just go, Argrave repeated insistently. She opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. Argrave just stared blankly, finger still pointing at the door. Eventually, their stalemate ended, and Mina stood and walked to the door. She pulled back the bolt and exited quietly. Argrave fell back onto the bed and sighed. This day had been long, but his work was truly just beginning. Chapter 5, Bloody Hard Work. Argrave approached most things very methodically. His present situation, unbelievable as it was no different. In the month he had until the thesis submission deadline, he worked long past nightfall every single day. His diligence could be attributed both to his desire to distract himself from unpleasant existential questions and his own legitimate fascination with magic. During this month, Argrave left his room only to eat or to retrieve what few books he needed from the library. Elias still sometimes shadowed him, but Mina avoided Argrave like a leper. It left him ample peace and quiet to thoroughly dissect things. After considerable deliberation, Argrave set aside examining 2 skills, inscription and imbuing. They related to the creation of magic items, enchantments. In other terms, Argrave had some plans for those 2 skills at a later date, but it required a lot of capital that he lacked presently. First, Argrave wrote down every elemental magic spell at or below D rank that he could remember from the original game, Heroes of Berenda. Once he had them written, he tested his ability to perform them, placing a check mark next to the ones that he could. If he knew a spell, he performed it as naturally as moving a limb. If he did not, it was like grasping at air. Some spells seemed engraved into Argrave's body like muscle memory. He paid deep attention to what was occurring when he cast the spells. He felt a strange energy permeating his body, indescribable and mystical, yet simultaneously overwhelming and nauseating. Perhaps the nausea was a mental issue from coming into contact with the unknown, though Argrave identified this strange energy. It was magic. Naturally, magic felt much like a gas roiling beneath Argrave's skin, as constant as his heartbeat. Indeed, a heartbeat was an apt comparison. If he held his hand to his chest, he could feel his heartbeat. If he touched the mystical forces of magic, he could feel its presence just as consistent as his own heart. Both were always present, and one needed only a cursory search to find either. Once Argrave had identified what spells he knew, he looked them up in the books he had borrowed from the library. There, he studied how they worked, and further how magic worked. The process was less challenging than he thought it would be. It felt intuitive. Perhaps it was because the former Argrave already knew these things. Argrave sat at his chair, hands outstretched. He willed forth a spell matrix, a horizontal line, nothing more. A small, constant gush of flame rushed forth. He pulled his magic away from the spell, and then morphed the matrix into a zigzag horizontal line. A small, sparking ball appeared in his hands. F-rank magic. One-dimensional, he noted, then turned back to his paper to summarize the feeling. This one-dimensional magic could only achieve very simple things, lighting a flame, creating a spark, or blowing air no stronger than one could blow from their mouths. They were simple things, yet these lines formed the foundations of the future branches of magic. Argrave held out his hand once more, then realized it was dangerously close to a bookshelf. He shifted the chair and pointed in a more open direction. He created another spell matrix in his hands, one with 2 dimensions. This time, a triangle. Fire emerged again, this time propelled forth by force rather than stagnant, and in his hands. E-rank. 2-dimensional. Argrave wrote down the feeling once more. He clenched his hand, and then turned back to an open book by his side, ensuring that he'd gotten the spell matrix right. Content it was proper. He turned back. Now for my favorite spell. Writhing lightning. It took him a second to form the spell matrix, but once he did, it felt like a lock clicking. He willed forth the mystical force known as magic, and a jagged bolt of lightning rushed across the room. It struck his bed. Argrave watched the lightning dance across the frame and covers, and then fade away. A smile came to Argrave's face. Just as in the game, this spell transferred lightning through surfaces. D-rank. 3-dimensional magic. Argrave pulled his hand back, staring at the unblemished pale skin. It was here where complex spells that achieved multifaceted effects manifested. Fire could be given force, allowing it to provide a concussive impact alongside the flames. Ice could spread across the floor or walls, trapping people where they stood. And C-rank. Argrave turned his head and opened a thick book. Unlike the other books that merely had diagrams, a spell matrix formed from the book, hovering in the air. Though he stared at it, and could recognize that it existed, it was difficult to wrap his head round. It felt blurry. C-rank was where magic departed from the mundane concepts of Earth and deviated into the mystical. A 4th dimension to a matrix. 4th-dimensional things were only theoretical on Earth. Learning one of these spells seemed a Stark's barrier of steel, standing tall and firm to block his advancement. Rather than foolhardily trying to break past that barrier, Argrave stopped in his tracks and directed his attention elsewhere. The thesis. It was a difficult thing to approach. Argrave had no illusions about himself. He could not produce original research in the brief time remaining in the month. The key point, though, was original. An acolyte was expected to create a thesis to become a full-fledged wizard. Yes, but their findings did not need to be entirely original. They could analyze a system or facet of magic, and that would suffice. Argrave could probably whip together something both from his days writing wiki articles and the recent studies he'd made into the magic system in his new reality. Argrave was bent over his desk in his chair, singing a little tune as he pondered what, exactly, to write about. Tropical hot dog night. Like 2 flamingos in a fruit fight. He half sang, half muttered. Suddenly, a splotch of red covered the empty parchment he sat in front of. He stared at the red drop, utterly perplexed for a moment. Then, another drop fell onto the paper. He saw where it came from this time. He raised his fingers to his upper lip. He pulled them away bloody. What is? Argrave felt nauseous for a moment at seeing blood, but he kept calm. He stood from the desk to stop bleeding all over good parchment, but the sudden movement made him feel lightheaded. He stumbled and tried to catch himself on the chair but failed. He collapsed to the floor, winded. Argrave flipped over on his back. He reached into his robe and retrieved his black handkerchief, holding it to his nose as he tilted his head back. After a bit of catching his breath, Argrave started laughing. Verdammt, he said aloud, muffled and nasally beneath the handkerchief. Guess being sickly isn't just a title. He couldn't rightly discern what had caused the nosebleed. Stress, maybe, or something simpler, but a small break couldn't hurt. Maybe even a medium-sized one. Besides, he needed time to think about what he was going to write about. After a minute or two, Argrave's arm grew sore from holding the handkerchief in front of his nose. He drew back the cloth and felt his nose. No more blood was flowing. He helped himself to his feet, ensuring that he did so slowly this time. He wiped off his face thoroughly, and then stared at the black handkerchief. A lot of blood. Argrave held the cloth by the corners, as though it were something disgusting. He was about to throw it in the wooden hamper for laundry, but he paused. The blood reminded him of something. Argrave, or at least, the former owner of his body, devoted his time and effort into blood magic. Most players of Heroes of Berenda agreed that blood magic was very weak in the early stages of the game. Sacrificing vitality for spells was not an especially appealing prospect. Blood magic spells were powerful and non-elemental, meaning few opponents could resist them. The spells themselves were somewhat slow, though, and few had usable effects. Once a player achieved an A rank in blood magic, they could do an optional quest to research blood infusion. This allowed players to infuse vitality into all spells to increase their efficacy. Low magic spells could be repurposed into cheap, fast, and highly damaging attacks at the cost of one's vitality. Blood infusion alone made learning blood magic worth it for the vast majority of mage players. Argrave was not naive enough to assume he could achieve blood infusion now, but his task was to make a thesis, and it did not necessarily need to be a proven idea. If he were to write a theory about blood infusion, an as of yet undiscovered facet of blood magic, that would be more than suitable. It might help get a foot in the door for restoring the terrible reputation Argrave has. With a smile on his face and his idea of a break entirely forgotten, Argrave tossed the bloody handkerchief into the laundry hamper and strode back to his desk. Can't write too much, though. Someone here at the tower might figure it out before I reach A rank blood magic. Discover blood infusion first would be disastrous. Argrave muttered. Like this, Argrave's focus redoubled. He spent the remainder of his first month on a new plane of reality locked inside his room, avoiding both sleep and uncomfortable questions. Perhaps not much had changed from his days in college after all. Chapter 6. Hitchhiking is dangerous. The halls of the Tower of the Grey Owl were filled to the brim with people. They were talking amongst themselves feverishly, most with some degree of relief and nervousness on their faces. Nicoletta of Montesi stood with arms crossed on an empty wall of the tower. Mina of Vedden sat at her feet, leaning against the wall in exhaustion. Nicoletta had spent the month revising the research Argrave had returned to her. Though she wished to find out if Argrave had genuinely been telling the truth, that the Crown Prince, in Dune, had ordered her research stolen, she had no opportunity. Talking with Argrave might illuminate the situation, but she had assumed that might have been exactly what he wanted. She disliked playing into others' hands. But the month had passed with utter silence from Argrave's end. Her friend, Mina, had been caught snooping around his room, but nothing came of it. It was all baffling. At this point, she was just curious what Argrave would submit to the order to advance from an acolyte to a full-fledged wizard. The door that Nicoletta had been keeping her eyes on swung open slowly. Argrave, wearing the same grey robes as every other acolyte, ducked beneath the doorframe into the hall. He had been quite pale the last time she saw him, but he was deathly pale now. He looked more like a walking corpse than a man walking. His eyes were sunken with deep black marks beneath them. Despite that, he still bore himself with the same neat dignity he had a month ago. Gods, he looks terrible, Nicoletta said out of surprise. Mina was roused from her exhausted state and followed Nicoletta's gaze. Probably waited till tonight to finish his stuff like I did. Mina stood, grabbing Nicoletta's robes to help herself to her feet. Why don't I get your sympathy? You also look terrible, Nicoletta said dismissively. Happy? Mina scoffed. I wonder if you'll pass. Worry about yourself. Nicoletta looked down at the shorter girl. Mina fixed her messy blonde hair. I'm always lucky. I'm not worried. Nicoletta frowned. It's a written submission. You cannot get lucky. At the far end of the hall, Argrave walked to the desk where an old man was receiving parcels. Argrave handed the man a fairly thick stack of papers, neatly wrapped in a black ribbon. After a brief exchange of words, Argrave turned away, pulling at the collar of his grey robes. His eyes scanned the room, stopping on Nicoletta. She tensed up at his gaze. His hollow grey eyes only furthered his corpse-like appearance. Now comes the time for the favor, she said in her head. Argrave walked towards her with long, even strides. Mina grew alert, stepping in front of Nicoletta. Argrave looked down on the two of them. Even skinny as he was, his height was still somewhat intimidating. Nicoletta kept her dark pink eyes fixed to his grey gaze. Your father is sending a carriage to take you back to Mateth, Argrave said, sparing even greetings. It was spoken as a fact, but Nicoletta decided it was a question. Yes, that's right. Why? I need to go there. May I ride with you? Not going to stay to find out the results early? Mina asked, stepping between Nicoletta and Argrave. It will take a week regardless. Argrave shook his head. There is a branch of the Order of the Grey Owl in Mateth, and above all, I am not worried over much about the result. Nicoletta scrunched up her eyebrows. Why ride with me? A ducal heir's carriage will be comfortable, well protected, and fast. And Nikki will be forced to listen to you, Mina said accusatorily. Argrave grabbed at his throat with his gloved hands. Is my voice so unpleasant to hear, Mina? How harsh. He lowered his hand and continued seriously. At worst, you will hear my snoring. I am tired. The trip itself is a week, Nicoletta said. I suspect you won't be sleeping all that time. You make me sound like a salesman with a shady pitch. Argrave shook his head. I just want a free ride to the city, not through life. There was quiet as Nicoletta thought the request over. Certainly, there was ample room on the carriage. I have no ulterior motive. I just wish for transportation. Argrave held his right hand in the air, swearing on it. Don't you have friends? Money? Mina asked. Mina, stop, Nicoletta said, feeling her friend was being overprotective. She kneaded her forehead. If I refuse, what will you do? Weep. Obviously, Argrave said trolley. I'm not sure. Probably sleep a night here, eat, and then walk to Mateth. Woe is me, etc. It is a long journey, to be true, but I know a good route. Argrave rubbed his eyes and yawned, fatigued. And why do you need to go to Mateth? As a royal bastard, I would assume you have housing in the capital, not Mateth. Ha. Argrave chuckled. The palace is the last place I wish to be right now. I have a great deal of things to do in and around Mateth. To sum them all up, I would say that I am preparing for the storm. That sounds important and yet appropriately vague, Nicoletta said with a sigh. Fine, you may come. But I would be remiss to mention this. If I find you are lying about lacking ulterior motives, you will be cast out. Cast out, Argrave repeated. How magnanimous. Thank you, Nicoletta. Argrave bowed slightly. I will pack my things. Can't forget my hand mirror. It will be good to finally get out of this robe. Argrave turned and walked away, heading back towards his room. Mina stepped forward and looked at Nicoletta, shaking her head in dismay. I'm suddenly having second thoughts about riding with you, Nikki. Why did you agree to this? You of all people should know that rumors are often exaggerated. I don't know much about him, but he's at least witty. He hit me with a book. Mina pointed to her face. But there was no obvious mark. It had been nearly a month, after all. Nicoletta doubted there ever had been a mark to begin with, though. Nicoletta sighed. If you're that insistent, I can tell him he can't come. Mina faltered now that the burden of decision had been passed to her. She crossed her arms and stepped away for a moment, thinking. If you're really fine with it, I suppose I'm just worrying for nothing. Argrave sat atop a velveted cushion, one leg crossed over the other. They had been riding for near 4 days now in relative quiet. Argrave was out of the grey robes of the academy and back into normal clothes. Argrave only owned black and gold clothing. The two colors were the traditional colors of House Vasker, and the former Argrave thought himself a true member of House Vasker despite his bastardry. After considerable deliberation, Argrave had decided that Mateth must be his first stop. A naval invasion would be occurring there. It was hopeless to prevent, but Argrave was certain that he could stop it before it spiraled out of control. He could perhaps stop it even faster than the player could in-game. Moreover, it was one of the few places in the continent of Berenda that would not have too many big-shot characters. Altogether, a lovely starting ground. Argrave balanced a book atop his knee, one thumb stuck in the page to keep it open as he gazed out through the carriage window. A fantasy game world was designed to be pretty, but to see it in person, it was enthralling. He saw a lithe, ferret-like creature in the woods beyond the plains. It had big, yellow eyes. Indeed, much of the time, Argrave could only see its eyes, as its fur was all the same green as the leaves. The creature was attributed to the wind. It was called a Wildlam, a mostly passive creature, but quite fierce. See? He's smiling like he's got some secret. Argrave turned his head from the window and looked at the two adjacent to him. Mina was pointing her finger at him. It was a roomy carriage, but they were still quite close together. A duty of knights patrolled the windows outside, slightly behind and in front of the carriage in order to not impair the ducal heirs and company view. Argrave stiffened his face, the smile he did not know he had fading quickly. He pursed his lips, somewhat annoyed to be drawn from his daydreams. I have come to realize you are rather like a cat, Mina. Mina straightened her back and opened her mouth to speak, but Argrave beat her to it. See? Argrave pointed. Your hairs start bristling like you've just been caught sneaking around in the dark of night, like a cat. You are slow to trust, and even to those you do like, you are not especially affectionate. And how would you know how I behave? Mina asked incredulously. She tapped Nicoletta's shoulder. Nikki, tell him he's wrong. Well, you're not lazy at least, Nicoletta said half-heartedly. At that, Mina stared at her as though grievously wounded. Argrave looked back out the window in an attempt to spot the small wind ferret once more, but the Wildlam was gone. Argrave pursed his lips briefly, then turned his head back to the book. It was a book on the 4th dimension of magic, C rank. It was the tallest barrier before Argrave's eyes. Mateth would suffer a full-fledged invasion soon. Argrave intended to curb its effects so that Berenda was not further weakened. For that, he needed personal strength and influence in society. Personal strength was one matter. Influence in society, well, money talks. He had a plan in mind. Though he had some things to do in Mateth and the places near it, Argrave had to devote much of his time to study. The game was vastly different from reality. In reality, one could not kill people and monsters and suddenly become an archmage by dumping their experience into magic skills. These things took time. Though I suppose I haven't exactly tried going on a killing spree. Maybe it is the same. A peculiar noise filtered through the windows of the carriage. It was like the distant rumble of thunder. As time stretched, though, the noise did not fade. Instead, It seemed to be growing louder. Argrave furrowed his brows and leaned to the opposite windows, pulling back the curtain. He saw a great cloud of dust in the distant hills. Argrave could vaguely see horsemen. They carried a banner of white, bearing a golden lion. House Parban, Argrave muttered. What? Mina moved to the window as well, looking out. Gods, that's a whole host of knights. You're kidding. Nicoletta moved to look out the window as well. Argrave's heart started to stir nervously. The man leading that host could only be Margrave Reinhardt, current head of House Parban. As a Margrave, his territory lay furthest south at the border to a great desert. He was Elias' father. Following the familial chain, that meant Argrave had crippled his daughter. Argrave closed his book and rubbed his temples with his fingers. It seems another time bomb found its way into his lap. Damn it. I should have remembered that Margrave Reinhardt marches to the capital on this day. All the introduction sequences for the 9 characters and after this has occurred, so the player never sees it. But I changed Nicoletta's fate of expulsion and left early. House Parban are friends to House Montesai, and my father would have sent an urgent message had that changed, Nicoletta said unconcernedly. But I wonder what this is about. Bruno of Parban was imprisoned by King Felipe III, Argrave explained quietly. The Margrave intends to secure his brother's release, undoubtedly. Though Argrave felt his heart beating quicker, he kept his face still and his tone passive. They don't have any reason to check this carriage. It's just a coincidence. Nothing bad is going to happen. Argrave scooted back to the other side of the carriage and opened his book again. He found out reading was impossible when he was this stressed. The thundering roar of the Margrave's host drew ever closer, the storm of steel and horseflesh nearing its crescendo. Nicoletta's carriage had come to a stop, yet it continued to rattle as the earth shook. Ridiculous, Mina said, grabbing onto the side of the carriage for stability. That must be every knight in House Parban's territory. Lady Montesai, one of the Duke's knights said, pulling his horse beside the carriage. The host will likely pass in front of us. They do not appear to be a threat. Argrave almost sighed in relief, but he kept his eye on his book as though he was unconcerned. Thank you, sir, and Nicoletta replied smoothly. One of the outriders is approaching, Rand followed up, craning his neck. From the armor and horse alone, it appears to be the Margrave. Nicoletta scratched her chin, thinking. Send a rider out to meet him. If he wishes to speak, have him come over. Argrave cursed in his head. He closed his book harshly, and it let out an audible pop. He set it in the empty space beside him and crossed his legs. I wonder if they would think it strange if I crawled on the floor and tried to hide. Though Argrave had already spoken to Elias, the heir of Margrave Reinhardt, he only did so because he knew Elias would be reasonable. Margrave Reinhardt, conversely, was hot-headed and valued his family very much. He led a host of knights to protest his brother's imprisonment. After all, Argrave had little faith that Reinhardt would be merciful in the face of the one who crippled his daughter, especially when he was already experiencing friction with the royal family of Vasca. It was not long before a second set of hooves came trotting beside the carriage, and a great white beast of a stallion with a bright red mane entered Argrave's view. Argrave leaned back as far as he could in the carriage, but he still saw a flash of long red hair. Perhaps I should have walked, Argrave thought grimly. Chapter 7, Argrave, Meet Margrave. A big, gauntleted hand reached forward and rested itself on the edge of the carriage's windows. Then, Margrave Reinhardt dismounted from his horse and stood at the side of the carriage, peering in. The Margrave had red hair like his son, though it was closer to crimson and fell past his shoulders. He had a fierce face, rough but scarless, and his frightening visage was further augmented by his eyes. They were like 2 rings of rubies. He wore a splendid white plate mail, a red cloak hanging from his shoulders. Margrave Reinhardt scanned the carriage with his haunting red eyes, his gaze finally locking with Argrave's. Reinhardt's face quickly changed from neutral to scornful as he recognized him. The two held their gazes, neither willing to turn away from the other. Margrave Reinhardt, Nicoletta greeted quickly, unaware of the covered conflict between the two. What brings you here with such a large host? The Margrave did not look at Nicoletta. My men and I were headed to Dirica. I thought to pay my respects to my friend's daughter, but seeing your company, I am questioning that decision. How rude. Mina is not that bad, Argrave said, holding the Margrave's gaze. He saw the golden-haired girl tense up at the mention of her name. I was not speaking to you, Vasca, Reinhardt said coldly. Correct, I was speaking to you. Quite the head on this one. Argrave smiled, mustering levity to dispel his anxiety. But you are incorrect in calling me a Vasca. I am but a humble bastard. Reinhardt tilted his head back, scowl deepening. He opened his mouth to speak, but Nicoletta spoke first. Why do you need such a large force to venture to the capital? She said quickly, evidently hoping to divert the Margrave's attention. Reinhardt finally looked away from Argrave, turning his head to Nicoletta. My brother was unjustly imprisoned, his evidence of treason clearly fabricated. The king sees only steel, and so I will show him some lest he forget his place as a just ruler. And during my journey, Reinhardt's gaze switched back to Argrave. Who do I find but his son? The Margrave stepped back to his horse, pulling a horn off the saddle. He blew the war horn once, and a deafening, deep noise filled the air. The thundering hooves slowed, and the carriage stopped shaking. Silence soon consumed the carriage, the faint wind and distant huffing of horses only barely breaking the now silent road. Argrave swallowed. He had detested the noise of horses, but now it seemed quite pleasant in comparison to this eerie quiet. What is the meaning of this, Margrave Reinhardt? Nicoletta maintained her posture, but Argrave could hear the nervousness in her voice. The royal bastard, Reinhardt corrected himself, stepping back beside the carriage, should come with me. I am a bit busy, Argrave said dismissively. Mina looked at him like he was mad, but Nicoletta tried to cover his words up. I am not sure why you are acting this way, Margrave Reinhardt, but presently, Argrave is a guest enjoying my hospitality. In turn, he enjoys my protection. Argrave was taken aback by Nicoletta's declaration. He had fully expected to be surrendered quickly. He was a bastard. Protecting him meant nothing compared to earning the favor of a Margrave. Then again, I suppose most of the main characters are good people. I shouldn't be surprised. Still, I'm grateful, Argrave thought, sitting up a little straighter. You would protect this foul cur? Reinhardt nearly spat. I would, Nicoletta answered without hesitation. The honor of House Montesai is firm. We protect those who we say we will, no more, no less. The nature of a person is irrelevant towards that pledge. Reinhardt stared icily at the obsidian-haired woman. Are you sure of this decision? That House Montesai will protect the royal bastard, Argrave? He is my guest, and a host should ensure their guest's safety. Honor demands I fulfill that pledge. Nicoletta paused, then spoke more urgently. House Montesai and House Parbon have been close for centuries. Will you end that for an unjust abduction? My brother was unjustly abducted, and cast into the dungeons at Dirica. If I can possess a guard that may ensure his safe release, the relation between our houses means nothing. Mina leaned forward in the carriage, pressing her head closer to the window. Not just House Montesai. I'm here, too, ninth child of Count Elgar, head of House Veden. My answer remains the same no matter how many I offend. I cannot call myself a Margrave if I forsake an opportunity to save my brother's life. Reinhardt's cold gaze bore holes in Argrave's head. Better yet that it be the ignoble bastard that crippled my daughter. Ignoble? Oh, yes. Start a war that kills thousands for your brother. How noble. Argrave chuckled. Time wastes while my brother rots, said the Margrave, placing his hand on his sword's pommel. Decide how this will end. Nicoletta started trembling. Argrave's own heart was pounding furiously. The time stretched out for a few seconds. How can I make the best out of this awful hand I've been dealt? Argrave thought, brain working on overdrive. He seemed to have only one choice. Perhaps it would be best if he made it, instead of having it made for him. Fine then, let us be off. Let it not be said that I am a foul cur who stands in the way of justice. Argrave pushed off the seat and reached for the carriage door. He grabbed the handle, but Nicoletta reached for his arm. What are you? She said, trying to grab his wrist. Argrave avoided her touch. I will go willingly, Argrave shrugged. If you defend me, at best, some of your knights will be foolishly injured in a futile defense. At worst, some will die, and this incident will cause intense friction, perhaps even war, between your two houses. That sounds unideal. And so, I will just go. But, Mina said hesitantly. No, Argrave said, shaking his finger. It is my choice. Place no burden on yourselves. He grabbed the bronze hand mirror and slipped it into his breast pocket. With it, he opened the carriage door and stepped onto the roadside. His legs were quite stiff from sitting for so long, and he stretched briefly. Still, Nicoletta, that you would protect me despite us being essentially strangers. I will not forget it. You are a braver person than I. How can you? Nicoletta said, trailing off. I'm sorry, Argrave. Did I not say that the burden is not on you? Argrave shook his head. Reinhardt kept staring at Argrave. His eyes were still cold, but there was something else. Disbelief, perhaps, or more optimistically some thin veneer of respect. Then, the Margrave wordlessly walked to his horse, reaching into a saddlebag to retrieve a rope. Oh Christ! Am I to be hanged, drawn, and quartered? Argrave was able to joke easier, for he found that his anxiety was fading somewhat. The choice had been made. There would be no conflict. That alone calmed his beating heart. The Margrave held the rope out. This is to be wrapped around your torso. I will be holding the other end. You will ride alongside me on horseback. What? Argrave frowned. I don't know how to ride a horse. There are many hours left before nightfall, Margrave Reinhardt said coldly. You will learn quickly, or I will drag you. Reinhardt walked closer with the rope, already beginning to wrap it around Argrave. Argrave flinched away, but the Margrave soon wound the length of rope beneath Argrave's arms. Horses are disgusting creatures. Can't I? Ow! Argrave trailed off as the Margrave tightened the rope fiercely. All right, take it easy. The Margrave pulled the rope tight, and then mounted back a Tropis stallion, brushing its crimson mane. He led it forth in a canter, pulling Argrave along. The sight of the gaunt, tall man being led about was quite pitiful. His complaints of abusing hostages and borderline slavery slowly faded away from the carriage, leaving Nicoletta and her entourage alone on the road. One of the Margrave's knights gave up a horse for Argrave to ride. After some fussing and fidgeting, the Margrave raised his war horn to his lips once more. He blew into it twice, and then the knights set off once again, leaving a great cloud of dust and grass behind them. Nicoletta opened the door to the carriage and exited, staring at the great cloud of dust slowly moving in the direction of Dirica, the royal capital. Her mood was complicated, and that fact was etched into her face. She was glad that no blood was shed, neither Montesi nor Parban blood. At the same time, it came at the expense of one person. Argrave was willing to forego his own safety, walking willingly into enemy hands, if it meant that none would get hurt. He did so all the while making stupid jokes, smirking like there wasn't a guillotine above his head. "How can you say that I'm braver than you when you do something like that?" Nicoletta muttered. It was difficult to believe that he was of the same blood as the House of Vaska, the family of snakes. Perhaps that was why he emphasized constantly that he was a bastard. He likely meant to show that he was nothing like the royal family. "Nikki, we should get back on the road," Mina said, crawling through and sitting on the window. "Maybe you can talk to your father, have him intervene somehow." Nicoletta turned back to the carriage, tidying her black hair behind her. "I don't know what good it would do. My father does not like interfering with the affairs of the royal family." "Ugh." Mina grabbed at her hair. "If we make a lot of noise about what Argrave did for you, for us, maybe your father won't be able to ignore it." "Possibly." Nicoletta rubbed her chin, then walked towards the carriage with purpose. "I certainly won't do nothing, not after what just happened." "I owe him that much." "You owe him nothing," Mina rebutted, slipping back inside the carriage. "He's the reason this happened to begin with. This is just the right thing to do." "But maybe he's a better person than I thought." Nicoletta opened the carriage door and clambered aboard. "I think you're still chapped about him comparing you to a cat. And now that it's just us two here, I can say that he's completely right about that." What is that supposed to, sir?" And Nicoletta interrupted. "Let's begin moving again." Fast-paced. "We need to return to Mateth immediately." "Right away, Lady Nicoletta," Rand agreed, moving to the front of the caravan. Nicoletta sat back down, stiffening when she sat on something hard. She reached beneath herself and pulled free a thick book. It was a book she was all too familiar with, for she herself had been studying it recently. It was about the barrier between D and C rank magic. Argrave had been reading this. "I'll be sure to return this," Nicoletta promised. Deep inside her head, Nicoletta was questioning that promise. Perhaps she would never have the chance to return the book. Someone dying on her behalf. It had happened before. She did not wish for it to happen again. Maybe this time, she could do something about it before it was too late. Chapter 8, Sun Tzu teaches horseplay. "What an unpleasant trip," Argrave complained aloud, sitting atop the rock as he cleaned off his clothes with water magic. Dust, dirt, grass, and worse covered his clothes. His upper legs had been chafed raw, probably because of poor posture. He had dealt with that as best he could with healing magic. Across from Argrave, the Margrave Reinhardt hammered in poles to set up a tent. The last bit of sunlight was fading, and so they were setting up camp. In truth, Argrave loathed complaining so much, but all words served a purpose. Reinhardt was an impulsive and wrathful man, but he was also honorable and charitable. He would never abuse a hostage. Like Sun Tzu said, if your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. "I'm in way over my head," Argrave muttered. "What do I know about enemies? Third-year college student. Disgraceful." The Margrave's white stallion neighed at Argrave as though to comfort him, red mane flowing in the wind. Argrave flinched and stared at it for a time. The longer he stared, the more his expression softened. Slowly, a smirk entered his face, and he looked back at Reinhardt. "I thought horses were disgusting before. I see now that I'm right." "Don't know why you ride these things." "Disgusting," Argrave said loudly at Reinhardt. Reinhardt paused, holding the hammer he was using to nail the tent's stakes tight in hand and gazing at Argrave. "Look at them," Argrave pointed. "They defecate randomly, like giant toddlers. Filthy, unclean. Their mouths are strange, like some foul cross between a mole, an antelope, and a human." "Then tomorrow, you can walk," Reinhardt said coldly. He turned back and started hammering once more, deep into the grassy soil. "All right, better than being stuck atop a horse," Argrave agreed readily. "Of course, we won't make it to Dirica as quickly." "How tragic." Reinhardt did not look over. "Never said we'd slow for you." "If I show up bloody and beaten, I'm sure King Felipe will show abundant mercy to your brother," Argrave bluffed. In truth, King Felipe would probably smile if he saw Argrave battered. The Margrave did not respond. He picked up another stake, it looked to be the final one, and bent over to jam it in the ground. "I am not entirely sure what you hope to achieve with this. You bringing me with you is not giving you a bargaining chip. You're carrying a little barrel of gunpowder." Argrave watched Reinhardt. Evidently, the man had decided simply to ignore him. "When we arrive and you tell the king that you're keeping me as a guest, he certainly will not scrape and bow and release your brother Bruno like nothing happened. He'll view it as an affront to House Vaska, like you killed his favorite dog or something. I'm not worth enough to him. Maybe if I was the crown prince, in Dune, or that holy fool Orion, he might take the situation seriously. But then, they wouldn't come with you willingly. And unlike me, they could probably escape from your little nightly order." "You're good with your words. If you don't wish to lose your tongue, keep it still," Reinhardt threatened. "Empty threats," Argrave called out, Though his heart did drop into his stomach briefly, his mind wandered as he wondered if healing magic could regrow tongues. He grew nauseous as he thought of the blood. Argrave stood. Having finished cleaning his black clothes, he could not mend the rips. But such was life. Have you ever paused to consider why exactly King Felipe imprisoned your brother? Argrave held a finger out. And before you get angry at me, I'm not suggesting he was legitimately plotting treason. Reinhardt walked over to Argrave. The Margrave was a little shorter than Argrave, but he certainly did not feel smaller in full plate with a robust body. His ruby-like eyes were unshaking. Your brother was one of many stewards in Dirica. Even if he had been planning treason, without your help, there is little he could have done. Bluntly put, besides being related to you, he is not important. King Felipe is not aiming for him. He is aiming for you. He is trying to incite a reaction. Knowing your impulsivity and your direct manner of handling things, a king wants his subjects to rebel. Ha! Reinhardt chuckled, but it sounded forced to Argrave's ears. I overestimated your reasoning. Argrave held his arms wide and shrugged. Laugh if you will. House Parban has been growing wealthier. New mines have been recently discovered on your land. You have a growing city, and lastly, a good seat. Your Lionsome castle. A king would be wholly justified in seizing those rich lands if his subject were to rebel. Reinhardt walked away from Argrave and grabbed a folded up. He waved it, unfolding it, and then cast it over the poles that he'd just hammered into the ground. King Felipe has true-born sons besides in June, the youngest of whom is just coming of age. He wishes to secure lands, incomes, and a future for Orion of Vasca, that holy fool. A great warrior, maybe even better than you, at the age of 24, a fitting lord for the lands of Parban. In the king's eyes, at least. Reinhardt stepped back, looking at the tent he'd built with his hands on his hips. Argrave walked a little closer until he felt the pull of the rope wrapped around his torso. The Margrave had seen fit to tie him to a rock, like some sort of animal. Argrave crossed his arms and watched. Do you really think the king would balk at starting and suppressing a small rebellion to increase his own power base? You are his vassal, true enough, but you only serve him because of your honor and perceived duty. Reinhardt looked to Argrave. Do not presume to know me or my intentions. I'll presume to know King Felipe III, at the very least. Argrave pointed to his chest. When we arrive and he learns that I am captive, he'll feign anger, indignance. Then, he, or perhaps my brother, in Dune, will order me killed. They'll pin that killing on you. Argrave spoke with complete confidence, because that was precisely one of the ways Argrave had died throughout the course of Heroes of Berenda. It had not been Reinhardt keeping him captive, but rather one of the main characters, Rulio, a rogue-type character. Another time bomb Argrave had to find and deal with. Enough of this, Reinhardt snapped. He moved to Argrave and grabbed the rope, untying it from the rock and yanking it forward. He led him inside the tent and tied him to one of the thicker posts. You will wait here while I stable my horse. I will bring back a horse blanket for you, and you will sleep on the grass. A horse blanket? I should share a quilt with a horse. First you tie me to a post, and now you bury me beneath animal accessories? Just let me freeze. Better than being reduced to a beast, most of all a filthy, unclean beast like a horse. Reinhardt paused, tying the knot around the post. He stared at Argrave, breathing deep and heavy, wrath brewing in his chest like a great storm. He furiously untied the knot, then yanked it, sending Argrave stumbling as he rushed off in a tizzy. I tried to be gracious, as a true knight should be to a hostage. Reinhardt spoke loudly as he walked outside the tent, drawing the attention of many of the other knights who were setting up their own tents. Have it your way, then. He grabbed the reins of his white stallion and pulled it just aside Argrave. Argrave diverted most of his attention to his feet to avoid falling. He wasn't sure that Reinhardt wouldn't simply pull him along. Some of the knights watched their passing, shaking their heads or smiling with schadenfreude for the loudmouth captive. Reinhardt dragged Argrave through all of the camp, until the distinct sound of whinnying and neighing became louder and louder. The knights had constructed a makeshift stable of sorts. A few knights watched over it, huddled over a pile of wood that was likely an unlit fire pit. The knights stood when they saw their Margrave dragging Argrave along. The Margrave gave a yank on the rope and threw Argrave in front of them. Argrave collapsed to the grass, landing on his elbows as gracefully as one could manage. It hurt more than he cared to admit. His body was quite fragile. Look after the hostage. If he talks too much, I leave it to you to decide how to shut him up, as long as he isn't hurt. Reinhardt led his own horse to the rest of the other horse flesh and tied its reins up neatly. Another thing, he's to sleep right next to the horses. Come on, Argrave protested, rising to his feet. You don't need to do this, Margrave. You didn't need to speak, the Margrave said as he walked by uncaringly. Didn't stop you. Argrave stared at the Margrave as he walked away, his back facing the knights that had been assigned to look after him. If the Margrave cared to look back, he could see a faint smile lining Argrave's face. Praise be to Sun Tzu, Argrave thought. Know thyself, know thy enemy. One battle, one victory. Far off from 1,000, but it's a start. He felt a faint tug at the rope around his chest, and Argrave turned his head to the knights behind him. One of them had picked up the rope. The Margrave has given us the order, one of the knights said, a serious-looking man with orange hair. If you do not give us difficulties, you will not be troubled. Like master, like servant. The Margrave chose honorable knights. Fighting the Margrave is a spellcaster with D-rank skills. Positively suicidal. Eluding these guys, though. I just need an opportunity and misdirection. I surrender, Argrave said, raising his hands in the air. Do with me what you will. The knights looked at each other, then eventually led Argrave to a post beside the Margrave's horse. They tied him firmly, yanking the rope tightly to make sure both the post and the knot would hold. They argued briefly about who would watch over Argrave. Eventually, they played a game of chance, and the winner stood just beside Argrave, watching him loosely. After that, they resumed their duties, fetching water for the horses, gathering wood from the distant forest for the fire. Argrave passed the time by staring at the sky. More and more knights brought their horses to the area, leaving them to the knights assigned on stable duty. The knights watched Argrave, but he kept silent. Unlike the Margrave, he could see no benefit in provoking them. Soon, the moon was peaking above the distant mountains, half full, bright, and still eerily red. It still gave Argrave shivers to see it. He bided his time. The Margrave's horse grazed on the grass, its appetite seemingly unending. The moon kept rising, and the last light of dusk slowly faded away as the two suns went behind the planet. Argrave frowned. He supposed this planet would be rotating around the suns. Was it even called a sun anymore? It must be a different star system entirely. The people still called them the suns, though. A faint scratching entered Argrave's ears. He turned its head to its source. One of the stable knights had retrieved a piece of flint. He awkwardly used his sword as the steel of the flint and steel, casting sparks onto the wood. He grunted in frustration. Just fetch one of the knights that knows magic, one of the men commented. Forget it. The knight crouching dismissed the other's comments. We can do it ourselves. Magic isn't everything. The wood's too wet to catch fire. It won't work, the other reasoned. Come on, we can just walk into camp. Won't take long. I can do it. The knight stubbornly refused. He set aside his sword. Hand me my gauntlet. I'll use it instead. Argrave watched the exchange, head tilted. The other knight sighed but handed him the gauntlet. The would-be fire starter put on his gauntlet and tried to snap with a flint. After a few tries, and some sparks cast, Argrave heard a distinct snap and some curses. Damn it all. The flint broke. He threw it aside. I'll get someone, the other said in exasperation. Argrave raised his hand. I can help, he yelled out. All of the knights near the horses turned their head to Argrave, looking at him. I'm an acolyte for the Order of the Grey Owl. I can start your fire, Argrave explained further. They all stared at him. The Margrave wouldn't like that, I don't think, the one guarding Argrave commented. Ah. I see. Argrave lowered his hand. It's no trouble. But if you insist. I was just cold too. It's just a fire, Marsh, the one who'd been using the flint and steel said. We can let him sit close. Keep a good eye on him. If he was dangerous, the Margrave wouldn't have left him to us. The one guarding Argrave shrugged. All right. But the rope stays on. They untied the knot and led Argrave to the fireplace. He held his hand out and used some simple F-rank magic to conjure a flame. Soon enough, the small pile of twigs and logs was set alight. Argrave sat on the grass, holding his hand out. All of the knights gathered round, letting out quiet cheers. Some heat. Finally, Argrave said. Just before the night gets truly cold, too. One of the knights scooched close, holding his hands out. Thanks, kid. Argrave nodded. He watched the flickering flame. It brought back memories. Long camping trips, with nothing to do at nightfall but sit and stare at the flame, eating whatever sweets they'd packed with them. He waited and waited, watching as the knights gathered around the flame. They could not fall asleep. They had Argrave to keep watch on. But more importantly, the horses. If they were to run amok, well, it would be devastating. Coincidentally, horses feared the flames. Turning his head towards them, he saw their beady eyes reflecting the fire. All of them watched the fire cautiously. These horses were probably well used to fire, being trained and raised by humans. But illusion magic, well, it was particularly effective on those that did not know about it. Animals knew nothing of magic. Argrave got closer to the fire, holding his hands up. It looked as ordinary a gesture as any. Illusion magic could muddle the senses, too, but it could also make something seem larger, more intense than it actually was. All of the knights were relaxed. It seemed as good a time as any. His heart was moving fast enough to burst from his chest, but he told himself that fortune favored the brave. Argrave cast a spell, Intensify, a D-rank illusion spell. In his eyes, nothing occurred. In everyone else's eyes, though, the flames would appear to roar to life, exploding into the air. The potent smell of smoke would fill their nostrils. The heat would intensify. After he cast the spell, some of the knights leapt away from the fire. The most immediate reaction, though, was the horses. They all reared on their legs and fought against what tied them to their posts. Argrave suppressed his spell, but the damage had been done and the horses spiraled out of control quickly. Animals tended to be keen towards each other's emotions, and one's reaction could incite the entire herd. Even a warhorse was not exempt from this, especially without a rider on its back. All of the knights nearby scrambled to get the horses under control. Some broke free from their bindings and galloped across the plains. Argrave stood, acting just as surprised as all the rest. He walked towards the horses in even strides, cutting his rope with an E-rank spell, Wind Knife. His hands shook dreadfully, but his mind was focused. Argrave clambered atop a large white stallion with a red mane, the Margrave's horse, completely avoiding the attention of the knights, who were distracted by their primary duty of keeping the horses. Perhaps they did not even expect foul play. Argrave cut the white stallion's binding and held its head, casting another D-rank illusion spell, Pacification. The horse calmed and obeyed immediately. With one quiet urge, the Margrave's horse started to gallop. Argrave was thankful that he learned how to ride today. One of the knights, the orange-haired one, noticed Argrave's attempt and moved to block him. The knight drew his sword and thrust at Argrave atop the horse. Argrave twisted his body and conjured another Wind Knife, just in time to knock the blade aside. The horse kept moving, slamming its body into the knight and casting him to the ground in a winded mess. Argrave heard shouts behind him, but he kept his body low to his horse and his mind on the plains ahead. He had been through this area many times in the game before. He knew the way to Mateth. If he were to get there, he would be safe. He heard a whistle, and saw an arrow just ahead of him on the plains. He twisted back and cast a large wind spell, Wind Wall, a simple, immobile barrier of wind that would stop any projectiles seeking him further. Then, he turned, lowering his body onto the horse. The thundering hooves of the Margrave's stallion echoed in Argrave's head. He felt the only sound larger was the beating of his heart, the pounding of his blood. His whole body was shaking in dread and excitement both. He dared to look back. The plains were empty. All that could be seen was a distant trail of smoke, and a few knights struggling to retrieve errant horses. "Hey!" Argrave said quietly, the noise lost in the wind. "Hey ha 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 ha." His giggles erupted into triumphant laughter. "Oh, Jesus Christ! I did it!" Chapter 9, Non-Illegal Robbery. It was dawn. The pale, somewhat blue light of the early morning suns began to make its way across the vast plain in front of Mateth. Subtle rainbows of refracted light dappled the landscape where the rays passed through drops of water at just the right angles. A lone rider, tiredly leaning on his horse, spurred his mount in a light canter towards the towering walls of the coastal city. Argrave felt exhausted. A night ride was not a pleasant thing. He'd had to stop occasionally to heal his chafed raw legs. If he had not chosen the best horse, the Margrave's horse, he doubted the creature would have lasted running all night. The moonlight had been sufficient for base navigation. If Argrave did not know his surroundings as well as he did, he further doubted he would have been able to make it without colliding into a tree or rock. The near-unending expanse of green, wet grass slowly gave way into great fields of gold wheat. Beyond them, yet more verdant fields lie, melons, orchards of plums, pears, apples. Closest to the city, and most heavily guarded, were the more arcane plants. They were few in number but varied in color, ranging from a bright, fluorescent blue to a rich black that seemed to eat the light around it. Argrave mustered what dim vestige remained of his sleepless mind to admire the beauty of a Mateth that had yet to suffer an invasion. It was the most beautiful city in the game, according to most Heroes of Berenda players. Argrave thought it looked much better in person. His eyes surely had a better resolution than the game. Higher than 1920 times 1080, at least. Maybe sites like these were why people bought 4K monitors. The city itself was very pretty. Its walls must have been made out of marble. Maybe it was magic fantasy marble, but it looked the same. They were stark and bare white, but statues lined the ramparts, spaced equidistantly like guardians watching over the vast fields out front the city. Argrave slowed his horse into a pleasant trot as they rejoined the main road into Mateth. Argrave listened to the horse's breathing slowly quiet as it regained its composure. It was a great horse, to be sure, likely bred and raised specifically for the Margrave to ride. He was very much looking forward to selling it for a king's ransom. Argrave joined the side of a large caravan traveling into the city, carrying loads and loads of wares. He straightened his posture and started riding like a normal person, though his legs ached something fierce. He passed through the towering walls of the city without issue. The guards checked the caravan's contents, but too many people passed into Mateth to check with each traveler. Seeing an all too familiar city layout, Argrave couldn't help but crack a slight grin. He led Reinhardt's stallion through the city, heading for a horse breeder that he knew of. He saw a great row of stalls holding fine horses. Argrave dismounted, walking to the front of the stables. "Hello?" Looking for the horse master, Argrave called out, "Voice horse." "1 minute, please." A voice answered. Argrave complied. Soon enough, a somewhat fit man with braided brown hair and a beard walked out of the building and to Argrave. "Hello, Robar, right?" Argrave asked. "Yes, that's correct, Lord," the man answered cautiously. "Have we met before?" "Not personally, but I know you well enough," Argrave answered, shaking his head. "You deal in horses, no?" "That's correct, Lord," Robar nodded. "Would you like me to take care of this fine animal for you during your stay in Mateth?" Argrave looked at the stallion. "As much as I would like to say yes, I'm afraid that's not the case. I have to be selling this horse." "Selling?" Robar repeated. "A man comes to me in ragged clothing, appearing exhausted, offering to sell a horse." "Forgive me, but my first assumption is not kind." "And why not?" Argrave asked. "Well, and no offense, my lord, but I see an exhausted man trying to quickly sell a horse. I first assume that it's stolen." Argrave frowned. "Stolen? Why would you think that?" he asked, incredulously. "Well, actually, come to think of it, you have a good point. But I assure you, that is simply not the case," Argrave said insistently. "Is that so?" "Yes, it is," Argrave answered firmly. "I was accosted by brigands on the way to Mateth, you see." "Well, not to Mateth, but rather to Vendel-Ebra and then onwards to Dirika. I am a recently released acolyte from the Order of the Grey Owl, intending to return home. I went to Mateth because it was the closest and safest place I could reach after escaping from the brigands." "The brigands, you say?" Robar repeated. "Indeed." "Brigands?" Argrave nodded, straining his tired mind to its fullest. "They were mounted on horseback, and they carried a banner of white with a golden lion. I assumed they were men of House Parban. I feel foolish, in hindsight. Nonetheless, they demanded my money and my books. Once I had given them that, I seized a moment of distraction, with some help from illusion magic, you see, to escape. I must thank this fine horse for the help. But I am penniless, and I need to return to my family in Dirika. I am forced to sell this fine creature to pay for an armed escort." Robar frowned, scrutinizing Argrave. "Well, that's..." "Come now." Argrave held his arms out. "These clothes are worn, true enough, but they're custom-fitted and well-decorated. Clothes for a man of my height must be custom-made, you see. I cannot claim to be from a great house, but I am a noble from the capital." "Your house's name?" Robar inquired. "Blackguard," Argrave answered after a moment's pause. "Argrave of Blackguard." "Well." Robar scratched his cheek. "Gods, I feel a bit paranoid, Lord. I apologize if I offended you." "Oh, come now." Argrave held out a magnanimous hand. "A man of your trade has plenty of reason to fear for being sold stolen goods. My father's horse was stolen once before. Fortunately, the boy did not know how to ride, and was caught quickly." "Thank you, Lord Argrave." The horsemaster bowed a little. "Let's see, then. This horse must be a custom breed." Robar walked to the horse, petting its mane. "Such a beautiful crimson mane." "Indeed. For generations, my family has traded in fine horse flesh." "I can tell." Robar walked around, admiring it. "As it neighed. It's well-muscled, too. It would make a fine warhorse." "It was bred for as much." Argrave nodded. He was glad he had cast off the ornamentation from House Parban that it had been decorated with. "Well, I can offer 3,000 gold for it," Robar said. Argrave squinted. "Robar. My family does horse trading, and I have accompanied my father on many a sale. This fine horse is worth far more than a mere 3,000. You could sell it for nearly 10,000, especially on the eve of a tournament." The two exchanged figures for a long time. Argrave was adamant and persistent. He had bought and sold many horses in the game, and he knew that the Margrave's was a very good horse, and Robar eventually grew tired. "All right. How is this? 6,950 in the form of a banknote," Robar proposed. "You can't carry around so many coins, anyway." "We have a deal," Argrave said with a smile, having doubled the price and then some. Robar shook his head. "Your family are surely horse traders. Few customers haggle as well as you." He walked back into the building, retrieving the money. "Here you are," said Robar after a time, handing the note in an unclosed envelope. Argrave checked the figure and then closed the envelope tightly. "Wonderful," Argrave said. "You may make a speedy profit. My father may rebue the horse in a few weeks' time at a generous price once I make it home." Robar nodded and held out his hand. Argrave politely declined, citing that he was filthy. Walking away, Argrave pinched the envelope tightly in his fingers. "Silvertongue spits filthy lucre. Now that I've got money, I'm free." He hid the envelope deep in his breast pocket, just beside the bronze hand mirror. "Few bumps, but I made it to Mateth. Now the real fun can begin." Nicoletta and Mina watched the streets of Mateth as the carriage rode by. The past few days, they had been discussing how exactly they were going to get their parents to take action. "And what if that doesn't work?" Mina pressed. "Then we try another way," Nicoletta answered calmly. "Suppose nothing works?" Nicoletta turned to her friend. "You sounded like you didn't care a few days ago, but now you're twice as eager as I am." "Aye. Well, you seemed like you cared a lot." "I was just trying to step up for my friend," Mina answered hastily. "Besides, the situation sounded terrible." He's fine." "He has to be," Nicoletta interrupted, not wishing to hear her finish that sentence. "He's witty. At the very least, he'll know how to avoid getting on the Margrave's nerves long enough to save his skin, maybe." Mina leaned out the carriage's window, resting her head on her hands. "I don't know. The Margrave mentioned something about his daughter." Nicoletta recoiled. She recalled that line. It had been on her mind, too. "Mina, we made it back as fast as the carriage would allow. All we can do now's try." "You're right, as always." Mina kept looking out the window, a silence settling between them. The carriage rolled onwards towards Nicoletta's father's castle. "Hey, Nicky," Mina said. "Do you see that horse? Is now the time to think about horses?" "No, seriously. Look," Mina pointed, speaking urgently. Nicoletta leaned to the window, following Mina's pointed finger. "Gods, Rand, stop the carriage. Nicoletta commanded promptly. Wait, what if it's just a, Mina tried to say, but Nicoletta had already opened the carriage door. There's no way it's a coincidence. They're identical. Same red mane and everything. Nicoletta bounded from the carriage. Her legs were stiff, but she still walked as fast as she could towards the stable. She recognized the place. Her father bought many horses from this stable master. Excuse me, Nicoletta said urgently, grabbing the door frame and leaning inside the building. I'm looking for the horse master here. Mina joined her, staring at the horse intently as though to discern if it was real or fake. Just a second, please. A male's voice responded. Soon enough, Robber walked out of the building to greet the two. What can? The man paused. Hold a moment. You're the young lady Montesai? No, that's right, Nicoletta answered quickly. This horse, she pointed to the red-maned white stallion. Where did you get it? Robber's eyes widened. Oh gods, forgive me, my lady. Forgive you? Nicoletta questioned. Why? If I had known it was the ducal famil, just answer her question, Mina interrupted. Robber swallowed. It was sold to me a few days ago. A very tall, ragged-looking man with hair. Well, hair the same color as yours, young lady Montesai, sold it. Called himself Argrave of Blackby, I think. Mina laughed out loud. No way. He really? She turned away, laughing into her sleeve. Ragged-looking? Nicoletta questioned. Was he injured? Injured? Robber repeated, surprised. No, he had no visible injuries. His clothes were a bit torn, though, and he looked exhausted. He claimed he was attacked by bandits bearing the banner of House Bourbon and robbed of his books and money. Nicoletta herself was stunned speechless for a moment. She joined Mina in laughter for a brief moment. Young lady Montesai, was the horse not stolen? Asked the clueless horse master. Well, Nicoletta said, suppressing her laughter. Some people may come looking for the horse. I will hand you a badge with Montesai's symbol. If they do ask about the horse and who sold it, send them to the Duke's estate. Do not give them any other information. Oh, I see, Robber said, his anxiety evidently not quelled with this news. Was the man related to the young lady Montesai? My cousin. Nicoletta smiled. Did he mention anything else? Where he might go, for instance? He mentioned he was an acolyte. He haggled ridiculously well, Robber complained. I bought the horse for 6,950 gold, gave him a banknote. He mentioned hiring an armed escort and heading to his home in Dirika. Nicoletta shook her head and walked away. Thank you for your time. Certainly, young lady, Robber called out. Then, the horse. Keep it, Nicoletta responded. Mina was just ending her giggle fit as they both walked side by side back to the carriage, so ran shortly behind them. To think that we were sitting in that carriage, brooding about what to do. I wonder if he's still around, Nicoletta commented. Maybe, Mina mused. Mateth is safe. He gets kidnapped, steals the Margrave's horse, sells it for near enough to buy a house. Nicoletta summarized things, marveling at the situation. Mina started laughing again. I think, maybe. No, I know that your cousin is a lot more fun than he looks. Chapter 10, Early Onset Eldritch-Induced Baldness. A few days had passed. After cashing the banknote and opening an account in the local bank, Argrave stayed at a fairly expensive inn in Mateth that valued order and cleanliness, virtues he found it difficult to live without, especially given the strenuous circumstances he had been through in the past few days. It was easy to overcome his misophobia when faced with the very unappealing prospect of being held hostage in opposition to King Felipe III, but now that the danger had passed, he cleaned himself up. Margrave Reinhardt would not waste the time to send men to find Argrave. He knew getting to his brother Bruno was far more important to the Margrave than securing a hostage. Argrave did not fear retribution overmuch. His relationship with the Barbons could never be repaired, though an unfortunate happening, but it was unavoidable. He had changed his well-to-do aristocratic clothes for firmer leather clothing, a shirt, boots, gloves, etc. Waiting for them to be custom-fitted to his considerable height had been the only thing delaying his departure. In truth, it was vaguely armored, but Argrave did not trust his weak body to support full leather armor. Once they were made, he left expediently from Mateth's western gate, following the road along the coastline for a time. He watched the ships coming and going from the docks in Mateth. Some things remained unchanged. The smell of the salt brought back memories of Earth. There was the unfamiliar, too. The smell of an otherworldly city, the sound of the people and carriages moving on the road, a caravel sailing the open sea, the pounding of a blacksmith's hammer from behind the city's stark white walls. Argrave sighed in wistful homesickness, and then walked towards his destination. He strayed from the roads, walking across the plains leisurely. Despite his blustering to Robber, there would be no bandits or foul beasts so close to the city, and his destination was not far. He walked across the plains until he began to see stumps left by lumberjacks, and then he walked beyond those until he entered the forest untouched by civilization. The trees were tall here, ancient, and their leaves so dense not a speck of a dying sunlight made it through. It was not long before his only company was the animals and his thoughts. Argrave was certain he was on the right track when he noticed the trees changing. Their bark became darker, as though winter emanated from deeper in the forest. The leaves went from bright green to a deep, rich color. The air itself seemed to change color. Rather ominous in person, Argrave commented to no one in particular. He stopped at a particularly tall and thick tree, likely the oldest in the forest. He stared at it for a time, brows furrowed, but eventually moved around to the back. He nodded when he found what he was looking for. A set of stairs had been carved into the roots of the old tree. It led up to a hollow portion in the base of the trunk that seemed to have been chiseled away in an age long since past. Mushrooms grew at points, like shelves in the alcove. The carved hollow housed a stone shrine. It was but a table, a tablet, a quill made of stone, and a statue. The years had covered the stone with moss, giving much of the grey stone a greenish hue. The statue was a grotesque thing. It depicted a malformed lump of meat vaguely resembling a head with a mouth possessing far too many teeth. It had 2 eyes, but they were not in alignment, as though its face was melting and drooping away. Argrave kneeled down before the shrine. Argrave picked up the stone quill and the tablet. He wrote on the tablet, "I seek wisdom beyond my years." It left no marks, but he was not surprised by this fact. He set the 2 items down, moved back a few feet, and waited contentedly. The mouth of the statue split open, its stone teeth retracting back into its mock gums. It widened further and further, acting more as flesh than stone. Then, a reddish, mercury-like portal spread out in the mouth from its throat. An arm emerged, skinny and long, and kept emerging. It could not be any shorter than 10 feet. Then a stubby arm pushed its way out, grasping onto the statue, and the thing began to pull itself from the statue. The emissary started to reveal itself in earnest. It was anthropomorphic, yet all its limbs were strangely proportioned and its skin resembled exposed flesh after being flayed. Its eyes bulged in and out of the socket in rhythm with its breathing. The dread emissary looked about the forest, not displaying any hostility. It stood awkwardly on one foot and its long arm because one of its legs was far too short. The emissary opened its mouth, revealing a set of pearly whites so straight they looked fake. "This shrine amongst the ancient trees still sees worshippers?" "We had no idea." The voice was very ordinary, entirely unbefitting of the creature itself. "I suspect I am the first to come in many years," Argrave answered calmly. "We know," the creature said passively. "And why have you come? Why do people generally contact a god of knowledge?" Argrave stared the emissary of Erlebne in its eyes without blinking. Any single emissary of Erlebne, the god of knowledge, was capable of killing Argrave. Those elongated or stunted limbs were ineffectual. Sure enough, however, the servants of Erlebne knew magic far beyond what any order of mages might teach. Argrave recalled innumerable days playing Heroes of Berenda where he had attempted to kill one of Erlebne emissaries for fun, only to be utterly pulped by ridiculous spells. That said, Argrave was perfectly safe now. He could sleep in the strange creature's revolting arms and no harm would come to him. Such a situation was unlikely to happen, naturally, but the point stood. The emissaries only defended themselves from attack. They were neutral beings because they were fundamentally merchants. They only bartered, and their only good was knowledge. Harming customers was bad for business. "You come seeking knowledge?" The emissary nodded. "Like so many before you." "Not true." Argrave held a gloved finger up and shook it. "I come offering knowledge, in return for a blessing from Erlebne." "Then you have wasted our time," the emissary said levelly. "No knowledge possessed by one as young as you would be worth a blessing from our lord Erlebne. I know the location of Oral Valor, and the Valhalla-Bound he stole from your lord." After Argrave's words finished, all sounds died. The wind, the swaying of the trees, the bugs and the birds, suddenly ceased to make any noise at all. Argrave could no longer hear even the subtle sounds made by his leather clothes as he moved. He felt his heart speed faster, but he could not hear it. Even if Argrave knew he was safe, it was difficult to stop the natural reaction to abrupt stimuli. The emissary spoke, and Argrave heard only its voice. "Even mentioning Oral Valor, you have drawn the eye of our lord Erlebne." The emissary did not display any of its emotion on its voice. It might as well have been talking about the weather. Perhaps it had no emotions to display. "That was my intention," Argrave responded, fortunately able to hear his own voice in this strange silence. The emissary's eyes withdrew back into its head, leaving behind the same reddish mercury portal from which the creature had originally emerged from. Argrave waited patiently, expecting this might happen. The emissary had returned to receive Erlebne will. In simpler terms, he was talking to his boss. Argrave used the time to calm his beating heart. Communing with ancient gods often was not particularly good on the health. Fortunately, this information was the only thing that he could currently offer Erlebne, a god of knowledge. If he wanted further rewards, doubtless he would need to become inextricably bound to Erlebne. Conveying this knowledge to Erlebne had been a secret quest in Heroes of Berenda. If one found out about the Valhalla-Bound, one could offer that knowledge to Erlebne. More simply, one could return the book directly. Hoarding this knowledge was useless to Argrave, as the Valhalla-Bound only contained top-level spells beyond his ken that he had no ability to retrieve. At present, Argrave was confident in this trade. Further trades, though, forget it. Beyond the very high possibility of early onset baldness from stress, He was tampering with a power that could very well lead to his insanity. A god was, fundamentally, impossible to understand. Ancient gods were further insidious and manipulative. He did not have the hubris the Greeks so loathed. Argrave knew his limits as a mortal, and he was not certain he could continue to meddle without losing his mind. Only one of the emissary's eyes returned, refocusing on Argrave. "Our lord is watching this conversation through my eye, Argrave. He will be very displeased if you are toying with us." Argrave could not help but shudder. He had not mentioned his name, yet the emissary knew. Perhaps he should not be surprised. "The master is interested in this deal." The emissary continued. "You would be willing to submit to a spell to determine the veracity of your words?" Argrave considered the question, ensuring there were no loopholes in its phrasing. "As long as the spell only discerns truth from falsehood, that condition is amenable." Cautious one, a valuable trait. "And you asked for a blessing in return?" Argrave nodded. "A specific blessing from your lord, the blessing of supersession, and it should be of the highest quality." The blessing of supersession would be an invaluable acquisition for Argrave on his path as a mage. It would allow him to connect his pool of magic to Erlebne, an ancient god, for a period of 5 minutes. In effect, he would be granted unlimited magic during its duration. Every emissary of Erlebne had this ability, and it was precisely why they were such potent spellcasters. He would still be limited to whatever rank of magic he knew. Naturally, for Argrave, who intended to primarily use the very costly electric magic, it was invaluable. The blessing had its drawbacks. He was borrowing the magic, and he could not use the ability again until he had paid back his magic debt. Ordinarily, one could not even use magic until they paid the debt back. The highest quality blessing of supersession Argrave asked for removed the condition. One paid back the magic debt at their leisure and remained capable of using their own pool of magic without issue. After Argrave had stated his request, the emissary turned its eye to look at the portal where its other eye once had been, communing with Erlebne in total silence. Its gaze refocused on Argrave after some time had passed. "You ask a very high price," the emissary said slowly. "Even amongst our lord's direct mortal servants, few possess a blessing of that sort." "I ask for a high price because I know the value of my knowledge." Argrave shrugged. "The grudge your lord bears against Oral Valor is deep, and I know well the value of Viatulfar. If I could retrieve it myself, I might." "Alas, Oral Valor is a very powerful person, and not someone a humble mortal like me can meddle with." "We see." The emissary once more looked to the portal in its vacant eye socket, and Argrave waited longer. "The Lord tells us that he can agree to provide a blessing of supersession of the highest quality, under the condition you answer 3 questions under a spell that differentiates truth from falsehood. In addition, the information contained in these questions must first be proven accurate by his emissaries. Simply put, we would retrieve the Viatulfar before you receive the blessing." Argrave hesitantly nodded at the conditions, but he was not entirely content. "Tell me the questions, first." The emissary raised its long arm, holding its hand close to its face as it counted down. "First, the location of Oral Valor in detail. Second, the location of Viatulfar in detail. Third, how you came to possess this knowledge." Hesitation crept in at the third question. If Argrave admitted where he originally came from even indirectly, Erlebne might take an unwanted interest in him. "Is the third question necessary?" "If you wish for the highest quality blessing," the emissary answered quickly, almost anticipating his words. Argrave clasped his hands together, staring at the gloves as he rubbed his thumb against his palm. He wanted the highest level blessing. An inability to use magic after its use would be very annoying. "If you do not ask for details on the third question, I agree to those 3 questions only." The emissary bowed its head lightly. "So it shall be." "Then, we shall cast the spell." Argrave gestured for the emissary to proceed. It held its hand out, and a red line of light shot towards his heart like the bite of a snake. Argrave did not resist, and he felt the oddity of another's magic for the first time in his life. The emissary's one eye stayed fixed on Argrave's face. "What is the precise location of the spellcaster Oral Valor, who wronged our lord Erlebne and stole the Viatulfar?" The emissary spoke, enunciating every word clearly. "Oral Valor inhabits an island known to locals as Black Isle off the coast of the northern point of the continent of Berenda, near the town of Cumden. The island is host to a volcano which Oral Valor has tampered with, making it shroud the island in ash. Oral Valor has a castle on the northern side of the island, concealed by illusion magic. He rarely leaves the castle, and even less so the island." Argrave held back no details, even giving more information than the spell would probably compel. "The earlier they recovered the Viatulfar, the earlier he got his blessing." The emissary carried on without missing a beat. "Where is Viatulfar?" "The book stolen by the spellcaster Oral Valor." "Oral Valor keeps the book close." "It is in the same fortress in which he currently resides." "It is likely still in the 3rd floor down, in the library at the end of the hall on the right." "How did you come to possess this knowledge regarding Oral Valor and the Viatulfar?" "I confirmed it personally," Argrave said slowly. "And it was true. He had gone there multiple times with each character from Heroes of Berenda. He was the primary contributor to Oral Valor's wiki article." The emissary said nothing for a time, staring at Argrave. The red light persisted. Argrave was worried the spell might react. "Well, it is the truth, no?" Argrave remained stone-faced. If he had been lying, the red light would have broken. The The emissary snapped, and the red light retreated. Indeed it is, mortal. Or at the very least, your mind and body believe it is the truth. We will confirm the value of your truth in the days to come. The sounds of the forest returned as suddenly as they had left. It was a little like one's ears popping from a change in altitude. The other eye of the emissary emerged from the portal resembling red mercury. Our business is concluded, then. Argrave nodded. I presume you will give me a token that will notify me when you are ready to offer payment. Most curious. You almost lead us to believe you have done business of this nature with our lord before. Perhaps an ancestor of yours provided you some knowledge. Yet even still, that does not explain how you confirmed the presence of the Virgilfar and Oral Valor personally. The emissary produced a red disc in its hands, seemingly from the air. Here, keep this on your person and you will know when we are ready to receive you. If you have somehow tricked us, Oral Valor is the only being currently in this realm who has done such a thing. And if your information is correct, that will be rectified. Argrave took the red disc. It had no markings and looked to be made of simple stone painted red. I look forward to receiving the blessing, then. If you like this audiobook, subscribe the channel for more videos like this. And join my Patreon if you want to support me, where you can find the complete collection Jackal Among Snakes audiobooks. Hurry up, what are you waiting for? Leave some comment and let me know if you guys like this story, or you have a web novel you like and want to hear its audiobook. I will be happy to create them for you. Please like, share, and leave a comment on the video.